He didn't even look up from his boots when he said it. That was what Evelyn Carter remembered most. Not the words themselves, though they would follow her for years, but the fact that Harold Briggs couldn't be bothered to meet her eyes when he said them. He stood on the platform at Creston Junction Station, a thick-necked man with a jaw like a fence post, and he looked at 2-year-old Lily the way a man looks at a broken tool he's already decided to throw away. "She's not what I ordered." 5 words. He said them loud enough for the station master to hear, loud enough for the 3 men leaning on the railing to hear, loud enough for the woman selling bread from a basket near the door to turn and stare. Then he picked up the single envelope he'd left for Evelyn, not even a letter, just a folded bill of fare for the next eastbound train, dropped it on the platform at her feet, and walked away. He didn't hesitate. He didn't slow down. The sound of his boots on the wooden boards faded without a single pause. Evelyn stood holding Lily against her shoulder, her travel bag at her feet, 19 days of train grime still on her coat, and not one person on that platform moved to help her. If you had been standing in her shoes, carrying a sleeping child in a town where nobody knew your name, with $43 left and nowhere to sleep that night, what would you have done? If this story moves something in you, stay with us until the very last word. Hit that like button, subscribe so you don't miss a single story we bring you, and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from, because we want to know how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to that platform in Texas, 1887, and meet the man who didn't look away. Oh, Caleb Dawson had not planned on being at Creston Junction that afternoon. He'd come in for nails, 16-penny nails for a fence line he'd been patching along the north pasture, and a sack of cornmeal because the last of it had gone to the cattle more than a week ago. He had $4 and some change in his coat pocket, enough for the nails and the meal and maybe a cup of coffee at the counter if the line wasn't too long. He was not the kind of man who spent time in town. He came in, he got what he needed, he left. He was walking past the station when he heard the man's voice, not loud exactly, but the kind of voice that carries the way a slap carries, suddenly and all at once. "She's not what I ordered." Caleb didn't stop walking. He turned his head, the way you turn your head toward a sound you can't quite place, and he saw the woman standing there with the little girl pressed against her shoulder and the man already gone, his back disappearing around the corner of the station building. Caleb kept walking. He made it about 15 feet. He stopped. He stood there in the middle of the road for a moment with his hands in his pockets, staring at nothing, the sun bearing down on the back of his neck. Then he exhaled through his nose, a short, impatient sound, and turned back toward the platform. He told himself he was only going to make sure she knew where the nearest rooming house was. That was all. Point her in the right direction, and then he was going to get his nails and his cornmeal and head home. He'd told himself versions of that story before. He was getting worse at believing it. Up close, Evelyn Carter was younger than he'd expected. Not yet 25, he guessed, though the last few hours had added something to her face that age alone doesn't account for. She had dark eyes that were working hard to stay steady, the kind of steadiness that comes not from calm but from sheer refusal to come apart in public. Her coat was too heavy for a Texas afternoon, the kind of coat you packed for a journey from somewhere genuinely cold. Her hat had a small blue ribbon on it that had once been cheerful and was now just exhausted. She was looking at the bill of fare Harold Briggs had left at her feet, not picking it up, just looking at it. Lily had her face buried in her mother's neck. She was small, barely 2, from the look of her, with dark curls matted from sleep and travel. One small hand clutched her mother's collar like she already understood that holding on was the only option available to her. Caleb stopped a few feet away. He wasn't good at openings. He'd never been good at them even before the years alone had stripped whatever social polish he'd ever managed. "Rooming house is 2 blocks north," he said. "Mrs. Alderman. She's not cheap, but she's decent." Evelyn looked up at him. Her eyes took him in quickly. The worn coat, the work-hardened hands, the hat that had been through 5 or 6 Texas summers at minimum, and he watched her decide in about 3 seconds whether he was someone she needed to be afraid of. She decided he wasn't. He wasn't sure if that was good judgment or desperation. "How much does she charge?" Evelyn asked. $1.50 a night, including supper." She looked back down at the bill of fare. He didn't need to be told what that meant. $43. He didn't know that was the exact number, but he could read the math in her face clearly enough. I only need a few nights, she said, quietly, as if she believed it. Caleb looked at Lily, who had shifted enough to peer at him from the safety of her mother's shoulder. Big dark eyes. Completely serious. The way small children are serious when the world has stopped making sense to them. Where are you headed? He asked. Evelyn's jaw tightened slightly. I don't know yet. That was the honest answer. He respected it more than he would have respected a lie. He picked up her travel bag before he'd fully decided to. It was reflex, mostly. The kind of thing his mother had drilled into him before he was old enough to have opinions about it. Train East doesn't come through until Thursday, he said. That's 4 nights at Mrs. Alderman's if you're planning on leaving. I know. She let him take the bag without protesting, which told him something about how tired she was. They walked to Mrs. Alderman's without saying much. Lily eventually turned her head enough to watch Caleb from a cautious distance. She had her mother's eyes, dark and careful, and not giving anything away. The trouble started at Mrs. Alderman's door. The woman herself was decent enough, like Caleb had said, a broad-shouldered widow who ran a tight, clean house and didn't ask unnecessary questions. But when she looked at Evelyn and the child, something shifted slightly behind her eyes. Not cruelty, just the kind of frontier practicality that had learned to separate problems into those it could afford and those it couldn't. I heard what happened at the station, Mrs. Alderman said. She wasn't unkind about it, just direct. Word travels fast in Creston. I can give you the room, Miss Carter, but I want you to understand, I run a respectable house. I can't have a woman in unclear circumstances staying longer than a week without someone in town vouching for her. Evelyn held Lily a little tighter. I understand. You'll need to find a solution before that week is out. I understand, Evelyn said again in the same tone. Flat, controlled. The tone of a woman who had spent the day being told what her limitations were. Caleb stood behind them in the doorway, still holding her travel bag. He had not intended to still be here. He had definitely not intended to still be holding her travel bag. I'll vouch for her, he said. Both women turned to look at him. He realized, mildly surprised to hear himself say it. She's staying at Dawson Ranch, he continued. The words came out more certain than he felt. As a hired hand, she'll work for room and board until she decides what she wants to do next. That's a legitimate arrangement. Mrs. Alderman studied him for a long moment. Caleb Dawson, she said, which was not exactly agreement but wasn't argument either. You got room for a child out at that place? The house has 4 bedrooms, he said. 3 of them are empty. He did not look at Evelyn while he said any of this. He wasn't sure what he'd see in her face, and he wasn't ready for it, whatever it was. Relief, or resentment, or something worse. Hope. They rode out to the ranch in the back of his wagon, Evelyn sitting on the bench beside him with Lily in her lap, and the travel bag at their feet. The sun was dropping toward the hill line. The road was dry and rutted, the same road it had been for 8 years, and Caleb drove it the same way he always did. One hand on the reins, not saying much. After about 10 minutes, Evelyn said, You didn't have to do that. No, he agreed. Why did you? He thought about it. The honest answer was not particularly flattering. It had something to do with not being able to walk away from a child who looked at the world the way Lily looked at it, with that quiet, serious face, and something to do with the fact that the sound of Harold Briggs walking away without looking back had landed somewhere unpleasant inside him and wouldn't sit still. I had room, he said finally. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. That's the whole reason? She asked. Seemed like enough. She didn't push it. He was grateful. Lily had fallen asleep by the time they crossed the creek bed at the edge of the property, her head tipped sideways against her mother's arm, one fist curled open in her lap. He found himself listening to the sound of her breathing, even unconscious, completely trusting in the way that only small children manage to be. And something in his chest that had been clenched up tight for a very long time shifted very slightly. He chose not to examine it too closely. The ranch looked in the long light of evening exactly like what it was, a place fighting to stay alive. The house itself was solid. His father had built it to last, and it had, though the years had taken the paint off the south-facing side and 2 of the porch boards needed replacing. The barn was in better shape than the house. The fencing on the north pasture was a patchwork project of varying levels of success. The fields, what should have been fields, were cracked and pale, the kind of pale that comes when the water table drops and doesn't come back up, and the sky stays empty week after week while you wait for it to change its mind. He'd been waiting 2 years now. The cattle were 31 head, down from 68, and they were thin in a way that kept Caleb up at night. Not sick, just hungry, and ground down by the heat, and increasingly disinclined to produce the kind of numbers a working ranch needed to produce. He sold 6 head in February at a loss. He'd need to sell more before fall, probably, unless something changed. He stopped the wagon in front of the house and helped Evelyn down with Lily still draped over her shoulder, heavy and warm with sleep. "It's not much," he said. Evelyn looked at the house for a moment. Not long. "It has a roof," she said. "It does." "And water?" "The well's holding, mostly." She nodded. That was enough, it seemed. She carried Lily up the porch steps and waited while he opened the door, and she walked into the dark interior of the house without flinching, even though he could tell by the way she turned slowly, taking it in. She was seeing all of it at once. The empty rooms, the layer of dust on the windowsills, the chair by the fire that had been his wife's chair for 11 years and had not been touched since. She did not say anything about any of it. "I'll get you some blankets," he said. That first night was strange in the particular way that strangers sharing a house can make a house strange. Caleb cooked the only thing he was reliably good at, beans and cornbread, and they ate at opposite ends of the kitchen table, with Lily propped between them in a chair he'd padded with a folded blanket. Lily ate without complaint, which told him she was hungry enough to eat whatever was put in front of her. Evelyn ate the same way. "She's a good eater," Caleb said, because something had to be said. "She's always been that way," Evelyn said. "She came into the world hungry, and she's been trying to make up for lost time ever since." There was something almost like warmth in her voice when she said it. Not much. She was still guarded, still careful, but it was there, the particular tone that parents have when they talk about the small, specific facts of their children that the rest of the world doesn't know. Caleb looked at Lily, who was working on a piece of cornbread with the seriousness of someone who understood that this was important work. Cornmeal on her chin, a crumb on her wrist. "How old?" he asked. 2 in March. He did the math. He didn't say anything about what he calculated, that Evelyn had been traveling toward this marriage for months, that whoever Lily's father was, he was not Harold Briggs, that she'd carried a 2-year-old across half the country on the promise of a man who'd walked away without looking back. "She looks like you," he said instead. Evelyn glanced at him quickly, then back at Lily. "People tell her she's pretty," she said. "I tell her she's smart. There's a difference." He thought about that for a while. After supper, he showed her the bedroom at the far end of the hall, the one his parents had used, with the window that looked south, which caught the evening breeze better than any other room in the house. He'd stripped the bed and put clean sheets on it that afternoon while she was settling Lily. He wasn't sure why he'd done that. Old habits, maybe. His mother's voice somewhere in the back of his head telling him that a guest's room should be clean whether you expected guests or not. "The lock on the door works," he said, without quite looking at her. She understood what he was telling her. "Thank you," she said. He went to his own room at the other end of the house and lay in the dark listening to the sounds that were not quite right. Footsteps that were too light, the small shuffle of a child being settled, a low murmur he could not hear clearly enough to parse, the sounds of other people in a house that had held only his own sounds for 3 years. He lay there a long time before he slept. In the morning, he came out to find the kitchen clean. Not just clean, organized. The dishes that had been stacked in a way he'd long stopped seeing were stacked differently, more efficiently, in a way he could immediately see made more sense. The pot he used for coffee was on the hook he'd always meant to put it on and hadn't gotten around to. The table had been wiped down. Evelyn was outside. He found her at the fence near the barn, looking at the cattle with that same careful, measuring look she'd given the house the night before. Lily was on her hip, pulling at the collar of her dress. "You could have slept in," he said. "I don't sleep in," she said. "Neither do I," he said. They looked at the cattle together. 3 of the cows were lying down in the far corner, which wasn't a good sign at 7 in the morning. The others moved with the slow, indifferent pace of animals that have stopped being in a hurry about anything. How long have they been like this? She asked. Since the spring. What's the water situation? Holding, he said. But not for much longer. He paused. There's a plan. I've been thinking about it for a year. There's a canyon east of the main pasture, natural runoff from the hills. If we built a dam, even a modest one, we could capture enough water and a good rain to last through a dry spell. She was quiet for a moment. How much rain have you had? Not enough. Then why build it now? Because it'll be worse next year, he said, and the year after that. The time to build the thing is before you need it, not after you're already down. She looked at him, really looked at him, the first time she'd looked directly at him without any kind of protective distance, like she was revising something. You've thought about this for a while, she said. Long enough. Does anyone around here think it'll work? He paused. No. But you're going to do it anyway. Yes. She looked back at the cattle. Lily grabbed her mother's ear with one small hand and pulled, and Evelyn gently extracted herself without breaking her attention from the pasture. Then you'll need help, she said. She said it like it was simple, like it was obvious, like offering to help build a dam in the middle of a drought that was slowly killing everything around them was just a reasonable thing to say before breakfast. He didn't know what to do with that. The first week was an exercise in working around each other, both of them too accustomed to being alone in their different ways to make it easy. Caleb had years of solitary habits ground into him so deep he'd stopped noticing them, the particular routes he walked through the house and barn, the way he preferred silence at certain hours of the day, the fact that he hadn't cooked an actual meal since the fall and had been eating cornbread and dried beef the way a man eats when he stopped thinking of food as something worth taking care over. Evelyn, it turned out, took food seriously. She cooked on the second evening without asking whether it was all right, just sorted through what he had, which wasn't much, and produced something out of it that was warm and actual, and that Caleb ate 3 full servings of before he caught himself and slowed down. She noticed. He could see her noticing. She didn't say anything. Lily, meanwhile, was systematically investigating the house. She was too small to be dangerous to anything but herself, mostly, and her investigations were conducted with the same grave attention she brought to everything. She would settle down in front of an object and study it with the focus of a scholar, then either accept it as part of the world and move on, or reject it with the quick, decisive motion of a 2-year-old who has concluded that this thing is not worth her time. She accepted the cat that appeared from somewhere in the barn. She rejected a tin cup that had a small dent in one side, pushing it away with both hands. She accepted the porch. She accepted the well, which worried Caleb more than slightly. By the end of the first week, she had accepted Caleb. Not dramatically, not all at once. Children don't do anything dramatically unless they've decided to, and Lily was not that kind of child. It was more like she started appearing near him, on the porch when he was sitting after supper, near the fence when he was doing morning checks. She never demanded anything and never spoke much. She was quieter than most 2-year-olds he'd observed, which was not a lot of them. But she was there, and her being there carried a weight that he hadn't been expecting. One afternoon, he found her sitting in the dust near the barn door, examining a nail with complete attention. He sat down beside her, not for any particular reason, just because the day had been long and the fence post could wait another 10 minutes, and she handed him the nail without looking up. He took it, turned it in his fingers. She pointed at something else in the dust, a pebble, a bit of twisted wire, and he handed it to her. They sat there like that for a while, trading objects back and forth with no conversation at all. And Caleb sat in the warm afternoon and felt something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt like himself. Not the self he'd been before. That version of himself was gone and he knew it, the way you know a field is gone once it's been burned. But something that was still genuinely, recognizably him. Not the man who survived, something more than that. It frightened him a little. He got up and went back to the fence. Evelyn noticed. She noticed most things, he was discovering. She was not obvious about it. She didn't comment, didn't press, didn't offer interpretations of what she observed. But she was watching, with those careful dark eyes that had learned caution early and hadn't unlearned it yet. She watched the way he moved around his own property, the way he paused sometimes at the corner of the barn, looking at the empty south field with an expression she couldn't fully read. She watched the chair by the fire that no one sat in. She watched him eat 3 servings of soup without noticing he was doing it, She didn't know everything about him yet, but she knew the shape of it, loss. The particular shape of a life that's been gutted and put back together without some of the original parts. She'd carried something similar herself. She was careful not to call it the same thing because she didn't know his story and hers was different. But she knew what it was to keep moving because stopping meant sitting with what you'd lost. And sitting with what you'd lost was a luxury you couldn't afford when Lily needed to eat and the road ahead was still uncertain. By the end of the second week, she told him about Lily's father. She didn't offer it as a confession or a bid for sympathy. She told it the way she told most things, straightforwardly, while she was doing something else. The way people tell you the important things when they're not looking directly at you. Lily's father was a decent man, she said. She was mending a tear in the hem of Lily's dress, and she kept her eyes on the thread. He got sick in the winter of '84. Went fast. He'd have provided for us. I believe that. I've always believed it. But there wasn't time. She paused. I waited 2 years. I tried everything I could do on my own, and then I wrote to the agency, and then I waited 6 more months, and then Harold Briggs wrote back, and I thought it was the only door still open. Caleb was on the other side of the room, going through a box of tools he hadn't touched in 2 years. He didn't respond immediately because the things he wanted to say were either useless or too large for the room. He could have just said no, he said finally, in the letter. He could have, she agreed. Instead, he waited until you were here. He did. The thread pulled through. She cut it with her teeth. I'm not ashamed, she said. Not defensive, just clear. I know some people will think I should be. I'm not. I made the choices I made because of Lily, and I'd make them again. He thought about the platform at Creston Junction. The bill of fare dropped at her feet, the sound of Briggs's boots walking away. He's the one who should be ashamed, Caleb said. Evelyn looked up at him then, just briefly. Something passed through her expression. Not gratitude, exactly, or maybe it was, but a more complicated kind. The kind that has some anger mixed into it, and maybe some relief. And underneath all of it, a wariness that wasn't gone yet and might not be for a long time. Then she looked back at the dress in her hands, and they didn't say anything more about it, and somehow that was enough. On the 14th day, Caleb started surveying for the dam. He'd sketched it out over and over on scraps of paper that he'd been keeping in the drawer of his desk. The angle of the canyon walls, the depth of the natural basin, the volume of water that would collect if a good rain came through. He'd done enough reading to know what he was attempting was not impossible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't cheap, and he didn't have the crew he'd need to do it right, but it wasn't impossible. He drove out to the canyon in the wagon, carrying a length of rope and a series of stakes he'd cut the night before. He spent the morning walking the site, driving stakes, measuring distances with the rope. The canyon was narrower than he remembered, or maybe smaller than the plan in his head had made it seem. But the walls were good rock, solid, and the natural basin below the narrowing was deep enough. He was so absorbed in it that he didn't hear the wagon until it was already stopped on the ridge above him. He looked up. Evelyn was on the seat with Lily beside her, and she was looking down into the canyon at the stakes he'd driven, and she had an expression he couldn't read from this distance. You drove out, he said. I followed your tracks, she said. He looked at the stakes, then at her. I was going to ask for help eventually. You were going to do it yourself for as long as you physically could and ask for help when you couldn't anymore, she said. He couldn't argue with that. She climbed down from the wagon and came down the slope, carefully, carrying Lily on her hip. She stood beside him and looked at the stakes and the rope and the measurements he'd scratched into a piece of board with a nail. Tell me what you need, she said. He told her. She listened. Really listened, the way people listen when they're not waiting for you to stop talking, but actually taking in what you're saying. She asked 2 questions, both of them practical. He answered them. She looked at the canyon walls. It'll take time, she said. Yes. We'll need more hands than just the 2 of us. Eventually. And everyone in town thinks you're wasting your time. They do? She looked at him for a moment. That same measuring look he'd gotten on the first morning, the look that was revising something. Then we'd better get started, she said. She put Lily down on a flat rock in the shade, handed her a piece of bread from her coat pocket, and walked to the nearest stake. Where do we dig first? She asked. Caleb looked at her. This woman who had arrived at a railway station with $43 and a 2-year-old and no plan left, standing in a drought-dry canyon in her East Coast coat, ready to help him build something no one else believed in. He picked up a shovel. "Here," he said, and they began. The digging started harder than either of them expected. That was the first thing Caleb learned about working alongside Evelyn Carter. She did not complain, but her body told the truth that her voice wouldn't. By the end of the first full day at the canyon site, her hands were blistered in 3 places she hadn't mentioned, and when she lifted Lily from the wagon seat that evening, her arms shook with the effort in a way she tried to cover by turning slightly away from him. He saw it anyway. He didn't say anything. She wouldn't have wanted him to. The work itself was slow and unforgiving in the particular way that earth-moving work is when you're doing it with inadequate tools and no crew. Caleb had 2 good shovels, a pickaxe that needed its handle replaced, and a wheelbarrow with a wheel that pulled to the left unless you corrected for it constantly. He'd been meaning to fix the wheel for a year. He fixed it the morning after the first day, before Evelyn came out to the barn, because he didn't want her fighting the barrow on top of everything else. They worked in shifts, roughly, one of them digging while the other kept watch on Lily, then trading off. It was not efficient. Lily was a self-contained child and could occupy herself for stretches of time that would have surprised most people. But she was still 2 years old, and the canyon had edges and drop-offs that required someone paying attention. They learned each other's rhythms by necessity rather than design, the way people learn things when there's no time to discuss them and the work is already in front of you. What surprised him most was that she knew things. Not book things, though she'd clearly had more education than most women her age he'd known in Texas. Practical things. She knew which end of a pickaxe to use in rocky soil versus packed clay, a distinction that sounds obvious until you've watched someone do it wrong for an hour. She knew how to read the angle of a hillside for runoff patterns. She'd grown up, she told him one afternoon without much preamble, on a farm in Pennsylvania before her family moved east, and her father had believed, with the kind of conviction that brooks no argument, that daughters needed to know how to work land as well as sons, because land doesn't distinguish between them. "He sounds like a practical man," Caleb said. "He was impractical about most things, and practical about the ones that mattered," she said. "He died thinking the farm would save us, and it didn't, but he wasn't wrong about the work itself." She said it without sentimentality, just a fact, the kind you carry and stop being surprised by. He understood that particular kind of fact. By the end of the first week of real digging, they had the foundation line staked and cleared. About 40 feet of base trench started on the eastern wall, and a growing pile of displaced rock and clay that was significantly more impressive than the corresponding progress on the dam itself. Caleb knew the math. This was going to take months, not weeks, and months meant getting through summer with the cattle already struggling, which meant selling more head he couldn't afford to sell, which was a calculation that kept him awake at night, staring at the ceiling and doing arithmetic in the dark. He didn't tell Evelyn any of that. She was working hard enough. He should have known she'd figure it out herself. It was on a Wednesday evening. He knew it was Wednesday because he'd been to town that afternoon for supplies, and the feed store was closed on account of the owner's wife being ill, which had left him with less than he'd needed and more time than he'd planned, that he came back to the house to find Evelyn at his desk. She hadn't gone through his papers. She'd simply been sitting with the ledger he kept, the one that tracked the ranch's finances, or rather, the progressive deterioration of them, open on the desk in front of her, not reading it because he'd left it open himself that morning and hadn't thought to close it. She looked up when he came in. She didn't look guilty. She looked like someone who had seen something she already suspected and had needed to know for certain. "How long?" she asked. He knew what she was asking. "Through the summer," he said. "Maybe into fall, if I'm careful." "And after that?" He didn't answer, which was itself an answer. She looked back at the ledger, closed it slowly. "You should have told me. You've had enough to carry." "That's not your decision to make," she said, evenly. Not angry, or maybe she was, but it was the kind of anger that's mostly exhausted and has learned to speak quietly. "I'm here. I'm working this land same as you. I deserve to know what I'm working toward." He sat down across from her. The kitchen was warm from supper. She'd made a stew that was better than anything he'd produced in 2 years, using dried beans and the last of a smoked ham that had been hanging in the larder since February, Somehow finding flavor in it he wouldn't have thought was still there. If the dam works, he said slowly, and if we get a reasonable rain before the end of the year, not a flood, just a reasonable rain, we could hold through the winter and have enough water in reserve to get the fields going again by spring. That's the best version. And the worst? He looked at the table. I sell the herd, the bank takes the rest, and I walk away from land my father cleared by hand. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. Then we need to make the dam work faster, she said. It's not about speed, he said. It's about... He stopped. We don't have the hands for faster. It's just the two of us and the canyon doesn't care about our schedules. Then we need more hands. No one in this county is going to... Harlan Webb, she said. He looked at her. What? The man with the farm east of the Alderson place. He came by yesterday while you were out checking the north fence. Wanted to know if you needed any help with the cattle. She paused. He looked like a man who needed something to do. Caleb frowned. Harlan Webb was 62 years old with a bad knee and a farm that was producing marginally better than Dawson Ranch, only because Harlan had a good well and had sunk most of his savings into it 3 years ago. He wasn't someone Caleb would have thought to ask. He also wasn't wrong that the man was restless. His sons had moved to Dallas, and the farm ran itself in ways that left Harlan with long afternoons and nowhere to put them. He'd work for nothing, Caleb said. He'd work for the same thing we're working for, Evelyn said. Because his well is going to run dry in 2 more dry years, same as yours. He just hasn't run the numbers yet. She paused again. Tell him what the dam would mean for the whole valley. Tell him it's not just your water. He sat with that. It was, he realized, not something he had thought to say to anyone because he'd gotten so used to people thinking he was foolish that he'd stopped making the larger argument. He'd been defending the plan in terms of his own survival, his own ranch, his own land, his own problem. He hadn't said out loud to anyone what he'd been thinking privately for 2 years, which was that the whole valley was drying out slowly and the dam wasn't a lifeline for Caleb Dawson specifically, but for every piece of land that fed off the same watershed. You're better at this than I am, he said. At what? Seeing what other people need to hear. She shrugged slightly. I had to learn it. When you're trying to convince landlords to extend credit, and merchants to extend terms, and everyone around you to give you 1 more month, you learn fast what actually moves people. It was the most she'd said about her life before the train, before Texas, before the station platform. He didn't press it. He filed it away. Harlan Webb arrived on Friday with his wagon, his bad knee, and enough dried beef to feed 4 people for a week, which he presented without ceremony and refused to take back. He was a rangy, quiet man with a white mustache he'd had since before Caleb was born, and an opinion about everything that he expressed at full volume, whether invited or not. He looked at the canyon site, walked the edge of it for 20 minutes while Caleb watched, crouched at the narrowing point, and squinted at the walls with the focused expression of a man who has spent his whole life reading land, and then stood up and said, You're building it in the right place, but you're going to need rock facing on the south wall or the first hard flood will push the base. Caleb had not thought about rock facing. I know where there's decent limestone, Harlan continued, brushing dust off his knees. About 2 miles north. I've had my eye on it for a different project that I'm now thinking wasn't worth starting. How much could you get? Enough, if we had a way to move it. They spent that afternoon figuring out the moving. By the end of it, they had a rough plan involving Harlan's larger wagon, some timber rollers he had at the farm, and a rope system Caleb had read about in a book on waterway engineering that he'd ordered from a catalog 2 years ago and had been reading and rereading ever since in the hopeful, slightly desperate way that people read about solutions to problems they haven't solved yet. Evelyn fed them supper. Harlan ate 3 bowls of the bean stew and announced that it was the best meal he'd had since his wife was alive, which he said with the particular gruffness of a man who has decided to tell the truth and is slightly embarrassed by it. Lily sat across the table from him and stared. Harlan looked at her. What are you looking at, little one? Lily considered this question seriously, as she considered all questions. Your face, she said. Harlan blinked. Lily, Evelyn said, in the tone that parents use when they're trying to intercept a disaster that has already partially occurred. It's a good face, Lily added, apparently having completed her assessment. Harlan burst out laughing, a big, genuine sound that filled the kitchen in a way that the kitchen had not been filled in a long time. Caleb found himself smiling before he could think about not doing it. With Harlan on the crew, things moved faster. Not fast, nothing about the work was fast, but measurably faster, in a way that let Caleb do the math differently and come out somewhere better than before. The limestone hauling took 4 days, and it was brutal, hot work that left all three of them exhausted in the evenings, in the particular way that real physical work exhausts you, cleanly, completely, without the jagged edges that worry leaves. Caleb slept better in those days than he had in a year. But the heat was climbing. July in that part of Texas has a quality to it that stops being describable after the first week. It becomes a presence, something you negotiate with rather than simply endure. The sky bleached out to a whitish blue that held no promise of clouds. The creek that ran along the east edge of the property dropped another 2 inches. 2 of his cows started looking worse. Not sick, but drawn down in a way that told him they were conserving energy, going somewhere internal that cattle go when conditions get serious. He started rationing the well water for the house more carefully. Evelyn noticed but didn't comment. She started using the wash water twice, once for laundry, then pouring it on the kitchen garden she'd started near the south wall of the house. A small plot of tomatoes and squash she'd gotten started from seeds she'd somehow brought with her in the travel bag, one of the details about her that still surprised him regularly. "You brought seeds on a mail-order bride trip?" he'd said when he first noticed the garden. "I bring seeds everywhere," she said. "You never know where you'll end up." He'd looked at her then, really looked, the way he'd been trying not to, and thought about what kind of person carries seeds on a journey like that. Someone who hasn't given up on putting down roots. Someone who, even in the worst of it, is still thinking about next season. He looked away before she caught him. The town of Creston knew about the dam by then. Word had gotten around the way word always gets around in small communities, not through any one person saying anything directly, but through accumulated sightings and half-conversations, the way information moves in a place where everyone knows which wagon belongs to which family and which tracks lead where. People had seen Caleb hauling limestone from the North Ridge. People had seen a woman swinging a pickaxe in the canyon alongside him. People had talked. The reaction was split in the particular way that frontier communities split on anything unfamiliar. A third of them thought he was brave for trying. A third thought he was a fool. And a third hadn't formed an opinion yet, but were waiting to see which of the first 2/3 turned out to be right. He found out about the talking when he went to town for nails again. He was always going to town for nails, it seemed. The dam consumed nails the way a river consumes rain. And the feed store owner, a heavy-set man named Cooper, told him while counting out change that he'd heard Caleb was building himself a lake. "A reservoir," Caleb said. "That right." Cooper looked interested and skeptical in equal measure. "You think it'll hold?" "If we build it right." "And the water rights?" "The canyon runs through Hale's land on the north side." Caleb went still. He had known that. He'd known it and had been, somewhere in the back of his mind, filing it under things he'd deal with when the time came. Victor Hale owned a considerable amount of land in the county, not the most, but enough to matter, and the north ridge of the canyon did technically border the edge of Hale's eastern property. "The canyon itself is public land," Caleb said. "The canyon is," Cooper agreed. "The ridge is Hale's. You might want to think about that." He thought about it the whole drive home. He didn't tell Evelyn that night. He told himself he would think it through first, work out whether it was actually a problem or just a problem-shaped thing that would dissolve once he looked at it directly. He dealt with Victor Hale before. The man was difficult, the kind of difficult that comes from having more money than he needed, and a persistent suspicion that other people's gains were his losses. But he'd never had a direct conflict with him. He lay awake that night doing the mental arithmetic of it, and somewhere around midnight the anxiety settled into something more like resolve. The canyon was public land. The dam was public benefit. Hale could disapprove all he wanted. He was still thinking about it when he heard a small sound from the hallway. He lay still, listening. It came again, a soft, uncertain sound, not crying exactly, but adjacent to it, the kind of sound a child makes when they've woken from a dream that wasn't quite a nightmare but was close. He heard Evelyn's door open, heard her quiet footsteps, her voice low and close. He couldn't make out the words, just the tone of them, the particular cadence of a parent talking someone small back towards sleep. It went on for a few minutes, and then it stopped, and the house was quiet again. He lay in the dark thinking about the dam and Victor Hale and the North Ridge, and also thinking about none of those things. Evelyn's blisters healed and came back and healed again. She stopped mentioning them. He noticed anyway because he noticed most things about her now in a way he hadn't planned on and wasn't entirely comfortable with. The slight change in how she held the shovel when her right hand was bad. The way she tilted her head when she was calculating something. The fact that she hummed while she cooked but stopped if she thought anyone was listening. She caught him watching her once, at the canyon. She was driving a stake, and he'd looked up from his own work and was simply looking at her. Not for any particular reason, not with any particular thought behind it. And she straightened and looked back at him, and neither of them said anything for a moment that was slightly too long. Then she said, "You're not working." "Taking a breath?" he said. "The wall doesn't build itself while you breathe," she said. "No," he agreed, and picked up his shovel. But she was almost smiling when she turned back. He was reasonably certain of it, even from that angle. He decided not to examine that either. Harlan brought his neighbor Decker by in the third week, a younger man, mid-30s, with two boys old enough to swing a shovel and a farm that was suffering the same drought in the same slow, grinding way. Decker didn't ask many questions. He looked at the canyon, looked at the limestone they'd already laid on the south wall facing, looked at the depth of the basin, and said, "Tell me where to start." His boys, 14 and 16, big for their ages, with the uncomplicated energy of teenagers doing physical work they actually believed in, moved material twice as fast as Caleb and Harlan combined. The pace changed. Evelyn started keeping track. She had a small notebook she'd been using for the kitchen garden, planting dates, water notes, the kind of practical documentation that only matters to someone who is planning to still be here when the things planted come in. She started adding dam figures to it, footage completed per day, estimated footage remaining, days at current pace, days at new pace. Caleb found the notebook on the kitchen table one morning, open to a page of her neat, precise handwriting. He looked at the numbers. Then he looked at them again. "This is faster than I thought," he said when she came in from the garden. "It is," she said. She poured herself a cup of coffee and looked at the numbers over his shoulder. He was aware of how close she was. She'd stopped being careful about distance sometime in the last week, the way you stop being careful about a threshold once you've crossed it enough times. At this rate, if Decker and his boys stay consistent and we don't hit unexpected rock in the center section, we could have the main structure finished by September. "That's before the fall rains," Caleb said. "If there are fall rains." "There have to be," he said, and then hearing himself, "That's not actually a plan." "No," she agreed, "but it's a hope. And hopes have to come from somewhere." He looked at her. She was looking at the notebook. There was a smear of garden dirt on her jaw that she hadn't noticed, and her hair was coming out of its pins in two places, and she was doing the unsentimental math of a woman who has learned to run the numbers before she lets herself feel anything about what they mean. He wanted, suddenly and with an urgency that surprised him, to tell her that she didn't have to do that she didn't have to hold everything at arm's length before she decided whether it was safe to care about it. He wanted to tell her that the ranch was going to be all right, even though he didn't know that, couldn't promise it, would have been lying if he'd said it, because she deserved someone saying something like that to her, and meaning it. He didn't say any of it. He handed her back the notebook. "Good math," he said. "Thank you," she said, and drank her coffee. The thing about working alongside someone every day under difficult conditions is that intimacy builds whether you invite it or not. It's not romantic necessarily, or not only that. It's more fundamental than that, the kind of knowing that comes from watching someone tire and recover, watching them handle frustration and weather and physical pain, watching them make small decisions under pressure and understand from those decisions what kind of person they actually are, rather than what kind of person they present themselves as. Caleb knew now that Evelyn didn't quit when she was tired. She got quieter. He knew that she cried once. He was certain of it from the sounds through the wall, one night about a month in, when she thought he was asleep and probably cried because she needed to, and because she'd been holding it for long enough that the body simply insists. He knew that she sang to Lily at bedtime in a voice she kept low, songs he didn't recognize, probably from somewhere in her past he didn't have access to. He knew she made decisions quickly and lived with the consequences without relitigating them, which was a quality he had always respected and never managed himself. He knew that she was scared. Not of the work, not of the drought, not of any of the specific nameable problems they were dealing with. She was scared of something underneath all of that, something to do with wanting and being disappointed, with allowing yourself to believe in a place and then having it not hold. He understood it. He'd felt the same thing for 3 years, applied to himself rather than to a place. The suspicion that if he let himself believe in anything again, the believing would be what broke him. He was starting to doubt that theory. It was a Saturday afternoon when Victor Hale arrived. Caleb was at the canyon with Decker's older boy, working the center section. Evelyn had taken Lily to the house for a midday rest. Harlan was on his way back from the limestone site with the smaller wagon. Hale came with 2 men Caleb didn't recognize. Not ranch hands, from the look of them, the kind of men who worked for someone the way that implies they might do various kinds of work, depending on what was needed. Hale himself was in his early 50s, broad through the shoulders and going to weight, the kind of man who had once been physically powerful and now exercised authority instead. He wore good clothes for the canyon. Another message. He stood at the rim and looked down at the work. Caleb set his shovel down and climbed up to meet him, because he didn't want to have this conversation while he was standing in a trench. "Dawson," Hale said. "Mr. Hale." Hale looked at the limestone facing on the south wall, at the progress on the basin clearing, a Decker's boy who had stopped working and was watching from below. He took his time. "I hear you've been busy," Hale said. "We have. This is a significant undertaking for one man." "I've had help," Caleb said. "So I hear." Hale's gaze moved to the ridgeline. His ridge, the north edge of his property where it bordered the canyon. His face was difficult to read, which Caleb suspected was intentional. "I've also heard you've been talking to people in the valley about the water benefits. That if this reservoir fills, it could supply the whole watershed." "That's true," Caleb said. "See, that concerns me," Hale said. He didn't say it with any particular heat. He said it the way men say things when they've decided how a conversation is going to end before it starts. "A public benefit built on land that borders my property. Water that runs through a canyon I have an interest in. I'm going to need to think carefully about whether I have an objection to this." Caleb kept his voice even. "The canyon is public land. The ridge isn't." "I know. And the water law in this state is complicated," Hale said. "I have a lawyer who finds it very interesting." The 2 men behind him hadn't said anything. They didn't need to. "What do you want, Mr. Hale?" Caleb said. Hale looked at him for a moment, and for just that moment, something showed in his face that was more honest than everything else he'd said. A calculation, sharp and clear, of how much what Caleb was building was worth and what it might cost to acquire. "I want to make you a fair offer," Hale said. "For the ranch, for the canyon rights, everything." He named a number. It was a fair number in the abstract. It would have cleared Caleb's debts, left him with enough to start somewhere else, smaller, without the weight he was currently carrying. Caleb looked at the canyon. At the limestone they'd carried 2 miles. At the facing Evelyn had helped him set on that south wall, stone by stone, in the July heat. A Decker's boy standing below, shielding his eyes to watch. "No," he said. Hale nodded slowly. The expression was back to unreadable. "I thought you might say that," he said. "I hope you'll think it over." "I won't," Caleb said. Hale looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back the way he'd come, his 2 men a step behind him, and disappeared over the ridge. Caleb stood at the rim of the canyon for a while after they were gone, looking at the work and feeling the weight of what had just happened settle around him, the way that real trouble settles. Not like a sudden blow, but like weather moving in, gradual and inevitable. He picked up his shovel and went back down into the canyon. Decker's boy looked at him. "Who was that?" the boy asked. "Someone who doesn't want us to finish," Caleb said. The boy looked toward the ridge where Hale had gone. Then he picked up his own shovel. "Then we better finish," he said. Caleb looked at him, 16 years old with dirty hands and a straightforward understanding of the situation, and felt something that might have been the closest thing to gratitude he had allowed himself in a long while. "Yeah," he said. "We better." They worked until the light failed. That evening, Caleb told Evelyn about Victor Hale. He told her all of it, the offer, the veiled threat about water rights and lawyers, the men who'd come with him. He told her the way she'd told him things, without softening the edges, because she'd made it clear she wanted the real version of what they were dealing with. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. He came in person, she said. Yes. That means he's paying attention. She thought about it. A man who doesn't take something seriously sends a letter. He came himself. That's one way to read it. It's the right way, she said. She wasn't worried exactly. Or she was, but the worry had been quickly organized into something more functional. He offered to buy because it's easier than fighting. If you'd said yes, he'd own the dam and the water rights, and every farm in this valley would be negotiating with him to access it. Caleb looked at her. He's not trying to stop the dam, she said. He wants to own it. That hit him with the particular force of something obvious that he should have seen himself. Hale wasn't objecting to the concept. He understood perfectly well what a full reservoir in that canyon would be worth. He wanted to control it, stop Caleb from finishing it himself, and then acquire it at a favorable price once the opposition was removed. We need to move faster, Caleb said. We do, Evelyn agreed. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet around them. Outside, somewhere in the dark, a coyote called and was answered, and the sound of it carried the particular quality of the Texas night, vast and dry and indifferent, the land going on forever in every direction without caring what any of them decided. Evelyn put her hands flat on the table. He noticed her hands, the blisters that had healed and healed again, the dirt under the nails that didn't wash all the way out anymore, the way they lay completely still and steady, even when the rest of her was carrying something heavy. He'll come back, she said. Yes. And when he does, it'll be worse than an offer. Most likely. She looked at him across the table, and there was something in her expression that was past fear, past calculation. Something that was simply true, the way true things look when someone has stopped dressing them up. Then we don't give him time, she said. Caleb held her gaze. Outside, the coyote called again. The night pressed in around the windows. Somewhere in the house, Lily turned in her sleep and was still. No, he said. We don't. They moved faster. Not recklessly. Caleb had learned enough from 2 years of ranch failure to know that urgency and carelessness were different things, and that confusing them was how men lost both the fight and whatever they'd been fighting for. But they extended the hours. They started before full light, working by lantern in the gray pre-dawn when the canyon walls were still cold and the air held a brief, merciful coolness that would be gone by 8. They worked through the midday heat that had previously driven them back to the house, wrapping their heads in wet cloth and rationing the water jug, and trading off in 15-minute rotations so no one went down from the sun. Decker's boys came every day now, not just weekends. Their father came when he could and sent them when he couldn't, and they arrived each morning with the unhurried reliability of young men who have found a thing worth doing. Harlan came 4 days out of 7, limping more than he admitted, and working harder than his knee had any business allowing. 2 other men from the valley joined in the 3rd week of August. Brothers named Pruitt, who farmed wheat on the low ground south of Creston, and whose fields were in worse shape than Caleb's, if that was possible. They showed up without being asked, without explanation, and simply picked up tools. The dam was taking shape. It was visible now in a way it hadn't been before. Not just a plan on paper, not just a line of stakes in the dirt, but an actual structure rising from the canyon floor, limestone facing on the south wall, packed earth and timber reinforcement on the north. The basin below it cleared and deepened to twice what the natural hollow had been. Standing at the rim in the early morning, before the work started and before the heat arrived, Caleb could look down at what they'd built and feel something he'd been careful not to feel, something close to belief. He was still careful about it. Belief had a way of making the next disappointment worse. Evelyn had taken over the accounting completely by August, not because he'd asked her to, but because she was better at it, and they both knew it. She kept the notebook updated daily, progress figures, supply levels, a running estimate of what they'd need to complete the main structure and what that would cost against what they had left. She'd started writing letters too, which he discovered not by her telling him but by finding an unsealed envelope on the kitchen table one morning addressed to a land surveyor in San Antonio. "What's this?" he asked when she came in from the garden. She looked at it without apparent concern. "I wrote to ask about the water rights question. Hale's lawyer said the law was complicated. I wanted to know if it actually is, or if that was just a thing he said to make it sound like it is." He looked at her. "When did you write this?" Last week. She poured coffee. I've been waiting to tell you until I heard back. He replied yesterday. She reached into her apron pocket and put a folded letter on the table beside the envelope. The canyon is unambiguously public land. The ridge is Hale's, but the ridge isn't the dam. The dam sits on public ground, and the water that flows into the basin runs from a public watershed. Hale's lawyer is correct that water law is complicated. He's incorrect that it's complicated in Hale's favor. Caleb picked up the surveyor's letter and read it. It was 3 paragraphs, technical and precise, and it said what Evelyn had said, in more formal language. You paid for this? He asked. $2, she said. It was worth it. He put the letter down. Outside, he could hear Harlan's wagon coming up the road, the particular rattle of that left rear wheel that Harlan refused to fix because he said he'd gotten so used to it that fixing it would just give him something new to worry about. You should have told me, he said. You were worried enough. That's not... He stopped. He'd said the same thing to her 2 weeks ago about the finances. She told him that wasn't his decision to make. He recognized the argument coming back around. Fair enough, he said. She was almost smiling again. He was getting better at catching it. Well, the rumors started the second week of August. Caleb heard the first one at Cooper's feed store. Not from Cooper directly, but from a man named Adler who was loading sacks into his wagon and mentioned it the way people mention things they find interesting rather than troubling, which meant he either didn't understand what it implied or he did and had decided Caleb deserved to know. The rumor was this, that Caleb Dawson was building the dam not for the valley, but for himself, that the plan was to control the water and charge access fees, that he'd already turned away 2 men who'd come to offer help because he didn't want witnesses to his operation. None of it was true. The 2 men who'd been turned away didn't exist. The access fees had never been mentioned in any form by anyone, but the specific practical detail of it, the turned away men, the fees, had the quality of invented rumors that have been constructed by someone who knows that vague accusations slide off while specific ones stick. He stood in the feed store holding a sack of nails and processed this information for a moment. Who's saying this? He asked Adler. Adler looked uncomfortable. It's just going around, he said, which was the answer people gave when they knew exactly where something came from and had decided it was safer not to say. Caleb paid for the nails and drove home. He told Evelyn that evening. He told her the whole thing, the specific details of it, the 2 fictional men, the fees, the way Adler had looked when he said it. He told her because she'd made it clear she wanted to know, and because he'd stopped being able to talk himself into protecting her from things she was stronger than. She listened. Then she said, He's not trying to buy you out anymore. No, he's trying to make the town do it for him. Caleb nodded. That was the shape of it. It turned the valley against the dam by making Caleb into the villain, and once the community withdrew its support, the labor dried up, the project stalled, and Hale could come in a second time with an offer that was less generous than the first, and more persuasive, because the alternative would be nothing at all. What do we do? He asked. It was the first time he'd asked her that directly. Not, what do I do, but what do we do? She noticed. He could tell by the small change in her expression, the way she took a breath before she answered. We don't fight the rumor, she said. You can't fight a rumor directly. You fight it by being visible, by letting people see what's actually happening out there. She looked at the notebook. Decker's boys are here every day. The Pruitt brothers. Harlan. They know what they're working on and why. The people spreading Hale's story haven't been to the canyon. The people who have been there aren't saying it. So we invite more people out, Caleb said. We let word spread that anyone who wants to see it is welcome, she said, not as a performance, just as, this is happening. Come and look if you want. It was simple. It was right. He should have thought of it himself, and he hadn't, because he was still fighting the old way. Head down, working harder, trusting that the result would speak for itself. Evelyn understood something he'd had to relearn the hard way, that sometimes you have to let people see the work while it's still in progress, because waiting for the finished thing gives your enemies too much time. Word spread the way she'd said it would, not through any announcement or organized effort, just through the existing current of conversation that ran through the valley, the same way water ran through it when there was water to run. By the following Saturday, 4 people Caleb had never spoken to at length came out to the canyon and stood at the rim and watched. By the Saturday after that, there were 11. Some of them came with food. One woman brought a jar of pickled beets and left it on the tailgate of Harlan's wagon without saying anything to anyone. A man named Geary, who farmed the ridge above Decker's place, showed up with his adult son, and both of them worked through the afternoon without being asked or thanked, loaded back into their wagon, and left. The rumor didn't die, but it thinned. The specific detail of it, the two turned-away men, started to collapse under the weight of what was actually visible. Victor Hale noticed. He came back on a Thursday, and this time he didn't bring his two men. He came alone, which was a different kind of message. He rode rather than drove, a good horse, and he came to the ranch house rather than the canyon, which meant he'd either seen the people at the rim and changed his approach, or he had a different kind of business this time. Caleb was at the house when he arrived. He'd come back midday to check on a cow that was showing signs of distress, and Evelyn was inside with Lily. He stepped off the porch to meet Hale in the yard. Hale dismounted and held the reins loosely in one hand. He looked at the house, at the small kitchen garden along the south wall, at the wagon tracks in the dirt. Taking inventory. "You've been busy with more than the dam," he said. "People have been helping," Caleb said. "I've heard." Hale's tone was measured in a way that the first visit hadn't been. Not warmer exactly, but more careful. The approach of a man who has reconsidered his tactics without reconsidering his objective. "I want to be straight with you, Dawson." "You weren't before?" A muscle shifted in Hale's jaw. "I made you a business offer, a fair one." "You made me an offer," Caleb said, "and then you sent rumors through the valley about water fees that don't exist." Hale said nothing for a moment. He didn't deny it, which told Caleb everything he'd needed to know about where those rumors originated. "My lawyer has been looking at the water rights question," Hale said finally. "So has mine," Caleb said. Hale looked at him. "You don't have a lawyer." "I have a surveyor in San Antonio who's very interested in the question," Caleb said, "and I have his written opinion, which I'm happy to share with anyone in the county who's curious." That landed. Hale looked at him with an expression that was recalculating again, the same sharp calculation Caleb had seen on the ridge, now running a different set of numbers. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," Hale said. "From where I'm standing, you're the one making it hard," Caleb said. "I'm building a dam on public land that will benefit every farm in this valley, including yours, if you have the sense to let it. You could have been a neighbor about this. You chose to be something else." Hale's eyes went briefly to the house door. "That woman you've brought in," he said. His voice shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but the quality of it changed. The careful calculation gave way to something with an edge. "You know what people are saying about her? A rejected mail-order bride dragging a child nobody wanted. That's what you've attached yourself to." The words hit Caleb in the chest with the particular force of something aimed precisely. Hale had done his research. He'd found the version of the story most likely to land. Caleb's hands tightened at his sides. He wanted to close the distance between them. He was aware of the wanting as a physical thing, the old frontier instinct that said there were some words that had only one appropriate answer, and the answer wasn't verbal. He'd known men his whole life who'd made decisions that way, and he'd seen what it cost them. Not always immediately, sometimes years later, but it always cost them. He stood still. "Say what you have to say about the dam, and then get off my property," he said. His voice came out steady, which surprised him slightly. Hale looked at him for a long moment, at his hands, at his face, reading whatever was there. Then he looked away, toward the canyon, with an expression that was still calculating but had acquired a new variable. "I'll be at the town meeting next week," Hale said. "I'll have my lawyer, and I'll have the question of those water rights on the floor for the whole county to hear." He put his foot in the stirrup. "Think about what I offered you. It won't be on the table forever." He mounted and rode. Caleb stood in the yard until he was gone. Then he turned toward the house. Evelyn was in the doorway. She'd been there, he realized, for some portion of that conversation, long enough to have heard the part about herself. Her expression was contained in the way he'd learned meant she was doing the work of keeping something back. "He knows about you," Caleb said. "Unnecessarily." "I heard," she said. He waited for something else, anger maybe, or the particular kind of wounded dignity that comes from being reduced to a summary. She had a right to it. Instead, she looked past him toward the road Hale had taken, and her jaw was set with a determination that was not anger and was not fear, but was something harder than both. "He said nobody wanted Lily," she said, quietly. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment longer. "I knew men like him back east," she said. "Men who use whatever they can find. Facts, rumors, children. It doesn't matter to them what the weapon is. They just reach for the nearest one." "Evelyn." "I'm all right," she said. She straightened slightly. "He's going to bring this to the town meeting. That's what he said. Then we need to be ready for it." She looked at him then, clear-eyed, direct, not hiding from it. "All of it, the water rights, the rumors, and what he said about me." She paused. "You should know that I'll speak for myself if it comes to that. I'm not going to stand behind you while someone picks us apart in public." He looked at her. "I know," he said. "I wouldn't ask you to." She nodded once, decisive, the same way she made every decision, and went back inside to check on Lily. The nights that week were different. Not in any way he could have named specifically. The house was the same house. The sounds were the same. But there was a quality to the evenings after Hale's visit, after what he'd said about Evelyn and Lily, that sat differently in the air between them, like a thing had been said out loud that clarified something neither of them had been naming. On Wednesday evening, he came in from a late check on the cattle to find Evelyn on the porch, sitting in the dark. Lily was asleep. The moon was up, 3/4 full, bright enough to see by. He sat down in the other chair. He didn't ask what she was thinking about because he could make a reasonable guess, and she'd tell him if she wanted him to know. After a while, she said, "Tell me about your wife." He hadn't expected it. He was quiet for a moment, not because he didn't want to, but because he hadn't spoken about her to anyone in 3 years, and the shape of it had changed. The grief had compressed into something denser, smaller, that lived in a particular part of him he'd stopped visiting on purpose. "Her name was Ruth," he said. Evelyn didn't say anything, just waited. "She was tougher than me," he said. "She wouldn't have wanted me to say that. She thought I was tougher because I didn't show it as much. But she was wrong." He paused. "She'd been sick for about a year before she died. She knew it was coming before I let myself know it. She spent that year, she spent it doing exactly what she'd always done, just more carefully, more deliberately, like she was making sure everything was in good order." He stopped. "What happened to your son?" Evelyn asked. Gently. "He was born early," Caleb said. "Ruth was sick, and the baby came too soon. He lived 4 days. He said it the way you say things you've said inside your own head so many times they've become worn smooth. Ruth lasted another 6 months. Then she was gone. The moon moved its small increment across the sky. "I'm sorry," Evelyn said. "It was a long time ago." "That doesn't make it smaller." He looked at her. She was right, and he didn't know what to do with being told that by someone who also knew it from their own direction. "No," he said, "it doesn't." They sat in the dark for a while longer, not talking, and the silence between them had changed from the silence of the first week, the careful, watchful silence of two people unsure of each other, into something different. Not comfortable exactly, because comfort implies ease and nothing about their situation was easy, but honest. The silence of people who have decided to stop pretending things are smaller than they are. The night before the town meeting, they lost a cow. Not to illness, to the heat, finally, and the water rationing that had kept the herd functional, but not whole. He found her in the south corner of the pasture at first light, already gone, the ground dry and hard around her. He stood there for a moment and felt the specific grief of a working rancher, which is different from other kinds of grief but not lesser, a loss that is both financial and personal, an animal he had fed and tended and watched weaken over 2 months of failing to provide for her what she needed. He dug the hole himself. It took most of the morning. Evelyn brought him water twice and didn't say anything either time. When he came back to the house, she'd made coffee and set it on the table and had Lily occupied in the yard, so the kitchen was quiet. He sat down and drank the coffee. 27 left, he said. She put her hands around her own cup. The dam will hold, she said. Not a prediction, not false comfort, just a choice. The way she made choices, fast and clear and without hedging. You don't know that, he said. No, she agreed, but I'm choosing to believe it. She met his eyes. Sometimes that's what's available, He drank his coffee. The morning moved on around them, the heat building its early claim on the day. Lily's voice floating in from the yard in the particular half-song, half-narration that she kept herself company with. He didn't feel better exactly, but something shifted. The small, stubborn adjustment of a man who has remembered that giving up is also a choice, and not one he'd made yet. The town meeting was held in the Creston Assembly Hall, a long wooden building on the main road that served as courthouse overflow, community meeting space, and the site of the quarterly dances that Caleb had stopped attending 3 years ago and now found himself regretting in a vague, general way. The hall held about 80 people comfortably. That evening, it held close to 100. Caleb had expected a crowd. He hadn't expected quite this one. He recognized most of the faces. Valley farmers, merchants from town, a few people he knew only by name and reputation. He saw Harlan near the front with his hat in his hands. Decker and his boys along the wall, the Pruitt brothers. Several of the people who'd come out to stand at the canyon rim. He also saw people he'd thought of as Hale's people, men who rented land from Hale or had done business with him in ways that created the particular kind of loyalty that is really just dependency. Victor Hale was at the far end of the room with a man in a clean suit who had the look of someone who spent a great deal of time explaining things and charged accordingly for it. Evelyn sat beside Caleb in the second row, Lily on her lap, Lily's dark eyes moving slowly around the room with the calm, comprehensive attention of a child who has learned that watching is useful. The meeting was called to order by Creston's mayor, a dry goods merchant named Ferris, who had the unfortunate gift of appearing completely impartial while being mildly afraid of everyone in the room. He read the agenda, which had been hastily revised to include, as item 3, a discussion of the Dawson Canyon Reservoir project and related water rights questions. Hale's lawyer went first, because Hale had made sure he was on the agenda before Caleb knew there was an agenda. He was efficient and precise and spoke in the measured cadence of a man who knows that most people in the room will not follow the specific legal argument and is playing to a different kind of understanding entirely. He cited water law. He cited the ridge boundary. He raised the question of whether a private party had the right to construct a significant hydraulic structure on land adjacent to private property without the consent of the neighboring landowner. He was careful not to say Caleb was wrong, only that the matter was legally uncertain, and that proceeding without resolution of the uncertainty was a risk to the community that valued stability. It was well done. Caleb had to admit that privately, through the anger that was sitting in his chest like a heated stone. Then Hale himself stood. He spoke without notes, which was a choice designed to look like confidence. He spoke about the valley, about water, about the history of the land and the traditions of how neighbors treated each other. He spoke about Caleb in terms that were never quite direct, never an accusation, never a concrete claim, but that accumulated into a portrait of a man acting alone, making unilateral decisions, bringing in outside elements that the community hadn't weighed in on. Then he stopped pretending to be indirect. "We need to talk about the situation at Dawson Ranch," he said, turning slightly so his words reached the full room. "A woman arrived in this town under circumstances most of you are aware of. She was rejected by the man who'd sent for her, which some of you might say is his failing. But she's now living on Dawson's property. No formal arrangement, no legal standing, working alongside men who aren't her husband, raising a child whose origins nobody in this town can account for." He paused. "I'm not saying what I think. I'm saying what people are talking about. I'm saying it because someone in this room should." The hall went quiet in the particular way that halls go quiet, when something has been said that everyone was thinking about but no one had been willing to say. Caleb stood up. He hadn't planned to stand up at that exact moment. His plan, such as it had been, worked out that morning over coffee, was to speak after Hale, to present the surveyor's letter and the practical argument, to let the legal question answer itself. That plan made sense as a strategy and had nothing to do with what was happening in his body right now, which was a thing past anger, past calculation, past the cold, steady resolve he'd held on to through all of Hale's visits and all of his rumors. But before he got a word out, Evelyn stood up too. She stood up with Lily still on her hip, and she turned slightly so she was facing not just Hale, but the room, all of it, the full 100 people, the familiar faces and the strangers and the people who had come out to the canyon and the people who hadn't. The room was looking at her. She let it look. My name is Evelyn Carter, she said. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The hall was quiet enough that a normal voice carried. I came to Creston in June of this year as a mail-order bride. The man who sent for me saw my daughter and left. Some of you were at the station. Most of you have heard about it. She paused. I'm not here to defend my circumstances. My circumstances are what they are, and I'd do the same things again for the same reasons. She shifted Lily slightly on her hip, automatic, unconscious, the gesture of a woman who has carried this child through everything. What I am here to tell you, she continued, is what I have seen at Dawson Ranch, since Mr. Hale seems to be interested in what goes on there. I've seen a man who has spent 2 years trying to solve a water problem that is going to affect every farm in this valley, including Mr. Hale's, including yours. She looked across the room, not accusing, just direct. I've seen Harlan Webb and the Decker family and the Pruitt brothers working that canyon because they understand what it means for their own land. I've seen people come on their Saturdays and bring food they couldn't spare because they wanted to be part of something that was bigger than their own property line. She looked at Hale. What I've also seen, she said, is a man who came to Caleb with a number, a fair number, I'm told. And when that didn't work, sent rumors through the valley about fees that don't exist. And when that didn't work, stood up in this hall tonight and put my daughter in the middle of it. Lily was watching Hale with her serious, unreadable gaze. Evelyn's voice did not shake. My daughter's origins are not a question for this room, she said. Her father was a good man who died. That is the full accounting. And if there is anyone here who would like to make her the reason we don't solve a water problem that is going to take this valley apart in 2 more dry years, then I am asking you plainly to think harder than that. She sat down. The hall was quiet for 3 full seconds. Caleb counted them, in the way that rooms are quiet after something real has been said. Not the quiet of agreement or disagreement, but the quiet of people recalibrating. Then Harlan Webb stood up. He didn't look at Hale. He turned to face the room, his hat still in his hands, his bad knee taking his weight without complaint. I've worked that canyon for 6 weeks, he said. I've seen what's being built. I know the watershed, and I know the math, and I'm telling you as a man who has watched his well drop 18 inches in 2 years, that reservoir is the difference between this valley existing in 10 years and it not. He paused. Victor Hale's operation has its own well, dug deep and at considerable cost, and he'd like very much for the rest of us to need him for water. That's the business interest at stake here. That's what you're being asked to protect tonight. That's an outrageous... You called a 2-year-old child's origins a public question, Harlan said, in the same flat voice. I'm not sure outrageous is the ground you want to take tonight. What happened next was not dramatic. Real things often aren't. They build in the small, cumulative way that actual change builds. One person speaking and then another, one voice at a time. Decker spoke. Then the older Pruitt brother. Then a woman named Garvey, who ran a laundry on the east side of town and who told the room that she'd been watching the canyon project from the beginning and that any man who brought a crew of neighbors together in a drought year without paying them was not a man building a private empire. Hale's lawyer tried twice to redirect to the legal question. The room wasn't interested in the legal question anymore. By the end of the meeting, Ferris the mayor called for a show of hands on whether the valley would formally support the completion of the Dawson Canyon Reservoir as a community water project. The support was not unanimous, but it was large enough and clear enough that Hale sat back in his chair with his hands flat on his thighs and said nothing further. It was not over. Caleb knew that. Knew it the way you know a weather system hasn't passed just because the rain has stopped for now. Hale was a man who played a longer game than one town meeting, and the fact that he'd lost this round publicly would make the next move less predictable, not more. But walking out of the hall into the night air with Evelyn beside him and Lily half asleep on her shoulder, Caleb felt the particular quality of a thing that has been said that cannot be unsaid. The valley had chosen, tonight, in front of Victor Hale and his lawyer and all 100 people in that room. That mattered. Harlan fell into step beside them. Good meeting, he said. You were good in there, Caleb said. I just said what was true, Harlan said, which was probably the most useful thing anyone had said all evening. Lily roused slightly from Evelyn's shoulder and looked at Harlan with her heavy-lidded, almost asleep gaze. Good face, she said, with the confidence of someone confirming a conclusion already reached. Harlan laughed. The sound went up into the dark Texas night, and it was warm, and it was real, and it lasted until he turned off toward his own wagon and left Caleb and Evelyn alone on the road with the stars overhead and the long drive home ahead of them. Evelyn hitched Lily higher on her shoulder, started walking toward the wagon. "She said that to me the first time we met," Harlan called back. "I've been trading on it ever since." Caleb reached the wagon and helped Evelyn up, taking Lily while she climbed and handing the child back when she was settled. Lily went back to sleep between one breath and the next, the way children sleep when they are safe. He took the reins. The horse moved forward. The road stretched out dark ahead of them, the same road back to the ranch with its cracked fields and its 27 head and its unfinished dam sitting in the canyon waiting for whatever came next. He thought about what Evelyn had said in the hall, every word of it, the steady, unflinching way she'd said it, and about the fact that she'd stood up before he had, not because she'd planned to, but because she was not a woman who waited for permission to defend something she believed in. He didn't know exactly when he'd started thinking of the ranch as something they both believed in rather than something that was his. He wasn't sure it mattered when. It had happened, and it was true, and now it sat between them in the wagon on the dark road home like a thing that didn't need to be said yet but was getting closer. Evelyn looked at the road ahead. Her profile in the dark was tired and certain in equal measure. "He'll try something else," she said. "Yes. We should expect it before the dam is finished." "I know." She was quiet for a moment, then, "We'll be ready." He didn't answer because she wasn't asking a question. She was simply stating what was true. They drove home through the Texas dark, and the stars were thick overhead. And somewhere behind them in the canyon, the dam sat waiting, half finished, its limestone facing holding the dark, in the same solid, patient way that things built to last hold everything that comes at them. They expected retaliation. They just didn't know what shape it would take. That was the thing about men like Victor Hale. They didn't operate on impulse. Impulse was for men who hadn't learned to convert anger into patience, and patience into leverage. The town meeting had been a public loss, and public losses required public recovery, and recovery required a different kind of move than the ones that had failed. Caleb understood this the way you understand weather, not with certainty about the specific form, just with certainty that something was coming and that the only sensible response was to keep working and stay alert. So they kept working. The days after the meeting had a different quality than the ones before it. Not easier, but clearer. The formal community endorsement had done something to the crew dynamic that couldn't have been manufactured deliberately. Decker's boys came with two of their cousins. The Pruitt brothers brought their father, a man in his late 60s with the careful, precise movements of someone who has learned to protect a bad back and still managed to outwork most people 20 years younger. Geary and his son came back, and this time they came 3 days in a row. A schoolteacher named Marsh, who Caleb had spoken to maybe 4 times in his life, appeared one Saturday with a pickaxe and the earnest, slightly over-prepared energy of someone doing physical labor for the first time in years. He was nearly useless for the first 2 hours, and steadily more useful after that. Evelyn kept the notebook. The numbers moved faster. By the first week of September, the main structure was within 2 weeks of completion. The basin cleared to its final depth, the south wall faced and solid, the north earthwork packed and reinforced with the timber framework Harlan had designed himself, drawing on a memory of watching his father build a smaller version of the same thing on a Missouri farm 40 years earlier. The gate mechanism, the controlled sluice that would allow them to regulate outflow rather than letting the reservoir simply overflow, was the remaining major problem. Caleb had spent 3 nights that week with the engineering book and a succession of sketches that progressed from ignorant to merely uncertain, which he counted as progress. He was sitting with those sketches on the kitchen table on a Tuesday night when Evelyn put a cup of coffee beside him without being asked and looked at the drawings for a moment. "What's the problem?" she asked. "The gate needs to be able to handle pressure from a full basin," he said, "which could be significant. The timber I've got is strong enough for normal load, but if we get a heavy rain and the thing fills faster than expected, I'm not confident it holds." She sat down across from him and turned one of the sketches around to look at it from her angle. He'd gotten used to this, her picking up whatever he was working on and simply looking at it, without asking permission, in the same matter-of-fact way she approached everything. "My father had the same problem on the farm," she said, "with the mill pond outlet. He ended up using 2 gates, a primary and a secondary set a foot higher, so if the primary failed or wasn't opened in time, The secondary would kick in before the pressure built to a dangerous level. Caleb looked at the sketch, then at her. A redundant system, he said. He called it a belt and suspenders arrangement, she said, which I always thought was a strange way to put it, but the principle held. He turned the sketch back around and looked at it with the new idea sitting on top of the existing one. It was a better design. It was a considerably better design, and the materials for the secondary gate were already at the site. He'd over-ordered on timber 3 weeks ago against exactly the kind of problem he hadn't been able to name yet. Your father was a practical man, he said. When it mattered, she agreed. She was almost smiling again, that edge of it that came and went. Don't tell me to sleep. I know when I need to sleep. I wasn't going to say anything. You had the expression, she said. He looked down at the sketch. What expression? The one that means you're about to say something considerate that I'll have to argue with, she said, and got up and went to bed, leaving him with the coffee and the sketches and the particular sensation of being known in a way he hadn't consented to and couldn't object to. The attack came on a Friday night, not the attack they'd been watching for, not lawyers or rumors or another visit with a number on a piece of paper. The other kind. The kind that Caleb had told himself Hale wouldn't resort to because men like Hale had too much to lose from anything that direct. And he'd been wrong. And that wrongness cost them 12 days of work and nearly cost them everything. He woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of something that wasn't right. In the years he'd lived alone on the ranch, he'd developed the particular hair trigger of a man who sleeps lightly because there's no one else to wake up. He was out of bed before he'd fully identified the sound, moving through the dark house by memory, and he was on the porch with his rifle before he understood what he was hearing. The canyon. Not from the canyon itself. He couldn't hear the canyon from the house. It was too far. But he could hear the horses moving fast on the east road, the road that ran along the ridge above the canyon site, and he could see faintly the orange suggestion of lantern light on the low clouds above the hill line. He was in the barn saddling his horse inside of 3 minutes. Not thinking about it, not planning, moving the way the body moves when it's been trained by enough emergencies that preparation happens below the level of thought. Evelyn was in the barn doorway when he turned with the horse. She had her coat over her nightdress and her boots on the wrong feet, which meant she'd moved fast enough that she hadn't noticed, and she was holding a lantern. Canyon? She said. Yes. How many? Couldn't tell. 2 horses at least. Maybe 3. She looked at the lantern, then at him. He could see her doing the calculation he was already past. What it meant if they damaged the gate mechanism, or the south wall facing, or worst of all the timber reinforcement on the north side that was still curing, still in the vulnerable stage where targeted damage could set them back to the foundation. Go, she said. I'll stay with Lily. He went. He rode hard on the east road, not bothering with quiet because quiet was no longer the advantage. They already knew someone was coming, or they would as soon as they heard hoofbeats on the ridge, and the only thing that mattered now was speed. The lantern light had moved. He could track it by the orange smear on the cloud cover. And as he came over the ridge, he could see it below him. In the canyon, 2 men moving with the focused efficiency of people who have been told exactly what to do and are doing it. They hadn't heard him yet. The wind was from the west, carrying his sound away from them. He stopped on the ridge, looked down. 2 men, one at the timber framework of the north wall, working at something at the base. He couldn't see clearly, but the motion was wrong, too purposeful, too focused on the supports rather than the surface. The second man was near the primary gate mechanism with a pry bar. Caleb's hand tightened on the rifle. He thought about what Evelyn had said to him in this canyon 3 months ago, when he'd nearly gone after Harold Briggs at the station. Not those exact words. She'd said them to him in a different situation about a different man, but the same principle, the same architecture of restraint. He wanted to win, not just tonight, permanently. And men who shot at unarmed men in the dark, whatever those men were doing, did not win permanently in a place like Creston County. They created problems that outlasted whatever they'd been trying to protect. He rode down the ridge slope, making noise on purpose, and by the time he reached the canyon floor, both men had heard him and turned. They had lanterns, but he had height and shadow. He stopped his horse a calculated distance from them, close enough for the rifle to mean something, far enough that he wasn't within reach of either of them. "Stop what you're doing," he said. Not loud, just clear. Neither of them moved for a moment. In the lantern light, he could see their faces. He didn't know them, which was a message in itself, because Hale had been careful enough to bring in men from outside the county. They were not young men, and they were not stupid. He could see them doing the same calculation he was doing, reading the angles, reading what was in his face. "Walk away from it," Caleb said. "Both of you. Get your horses and ride back whatever direction you came from, and what happened here tonight is between us." The man near the gate mechanism looked at the other one. A conversation happened with no words. "Mr. Hale," the first man started. "Isn't here," Caleb said. "You are. And whatever he's paying you is not enough to make what comes next worth it if you don't walk away right now." He meant it as a choice. He meant it as the alternative to what a man with a rifle in the dark could choose to do, and he let them read it that way. He was not going to shoot them, but they didn't know that. The second man set the pry bar down, slowly, with the deliberate care of someone who wants what they're doing to be visible. Then they walked back up the slope to where their horses were tied on the north ridge, Hale's ridge, and he listened to the sound of them leaving until he couldn't hear them anymore. He got off the horse and went to the gate mechanism with a lantern. The pry bar had damaged the primary mounting bracket on the left side. Not catastrophically, not irreparably, but it had pulled the anchor bolt and bent the iron plate, and that meant the gate wouldn't seat correctly under load. The timber framework had been partially undermined at the northeast corner. 3 of the foundation stakes had been worked loose, and the packing around them disturbed. He stood in the canyon at 2:30 in the morning and took the full inventory of it, 12 days maybe, with full crew. If the timber could be repacked without having to reset the entire framework, if the gate plate could be hammered back, which he wasn't certain of until he had better light and a blacksmith's eye on it. He sat down on a limestone block and put the lantern on the ground beside him. The canyon was silent. The stars above it were enormous and indifferent, the way the sky is indifferent at 2 in the morning when you're sitting alone in a hole in the ground, looking at the work someone just tried to take from you. He was tired in a way that went past the physical. Not defeated. He noticed that specifically, checking for it the way you check a wound to see how deep it goes. Not defeated, but tired. He rode home before dawn. Home. Evelyn was on the porch. She'd gone back inside for a coat and came back out to wait, and she'd been there long enough that the lantern beside her had burned down considerably. Lily was asleep. The house was quiet. She stood up when she heard the horse. He told her what had happened, told her all of it. The 2 men, the damage, the estimates on repair time. He told it flat and complete, the way she told him things, because anything less would have been an insult to what they'd built together. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, "Did you get a good look at them?" "Good enough." "Could you identify them?" "In a line?" "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "Then we need to go to the county sheriff in the morning." He'd been thinking about it on the ride back. "I can't prove they were sent by Hale." "No," she said, "but you can prove 2 men were in that canyon at 2 in the morning doing damage to a structure the community endorsed, and that you witnessed it." She looked at him. "Hale doesn't know you sent them away without confrontation. He's going to expect to hear nothing tonight, and then tomorrow he's going to expect to hear that the north wall needs resetting. He's not expecting a formal report." She was right. He was too tired to see it as quickly as she was. "The sheriff is—" he started. "The sheriff was at the town meeting," she said. "He voted for the project." She paused. "He's also up for re-election in the spring, and being the man who failed to investigate damage to a community water project is not the position he wants to be in." Caleb looked at her. At the lantern light on her face, the steadiness in it, the particular quality she had of being most clear-eyed exactly when the situation was most difficult. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you," she said. 4 hours. Then we go to town." Sheriff Brandt was a deliberate man. Deliberate in the literal sense, his natural pace at everything being somewhere between thorough and slow. And he listened to Caleb's account the following morning with the focused attention of someone who is measuring what they're hearing against what it's going to require them to do. He asked the right questions. He asked them twice in some cases, from different angles. When Caleb was done, Brandt looked at his desk for a moment and said, "You said they mentioned Hale by name." "One of them started to," Caleb said Mr. Hale, and then stopped. Brandt nodded. "That's something." He thought for another moment. "You sent them off without taking them in." I had one rifle and they had numbers even if they were on foot, Caleb said, and I had a damaged dam to inspect. Brant nodded again. He wasn't criticizing the decision, just accounting for it. I'll go out to the canyon myself and document the damage, he said. And then I'm going to have a conversation with Victor Hale. He'll deny it, Caleb said. Most people deny things, Brant said mildly. That doesn't mean I don't have the conversation. He stood. You have witnesses who can verify the state of the mechanism before last night? Decker's boys were there yesterday afternoon, Caleb said. They know what the gate looked like. Get me a written account from them, today if possible. They drove home, got Decker's account written and signed that afternoon. The man was shaken and angry in the contained way that quietly furious people are angry, all of it held very still, and delivered it to Brant's office by 4 o'clock. Brant had already been to the canyon. He had not yet gone to Hale. I'll go tomorrow, he said. Don't do anything in the meantime. We're going to fix the gate, Caleb said. That's fine, Brant said. Just don't go near Hale. The repair took 11 days, not 12. Harlan knew a blacksmith in the next town over who came on short notice and charged a fair price and hammered the gate plate back to functional without complaint, and the timber repacking went faster because Decker's boys had learned the foundation work well enough by then to do it without Caleb directing every stake. People showed up for those 11 days in numbers that hadn't come before. Word had gotten around, not from Caleb, not from Evelyn, but from Decker, who was not a man who talked much and was therefore more credible when he did. The story spread through the valley in 24 hours, and the response was not sympathy, exactly, but something more practical than sympathy. People came with tools. They came early, and they stayed late, and they did not need to be told what to do because they'd been watching the project long enough that they understood its logic. Evelyn fed people. It was the only word for it. The kitchen at the ranch became a supply operation. Bread and soup and whatever she could make work with what they had and what people brought, which was more than she'd expected. Women from the valley brought food they'd been holding back for winter stores, not because they were extravagant, but because they'd made a calculation that the dam being finished was worth eating leaner this fall. Lily moved through all of it with her characteristic composure. She had a favorite among Decker's boys, the older one, 16-year-old Thomas, who had made the mistake in week 1 of teaching her how to sort rocks by color, which she had since elevated to a daily occupation. She brought him rocks every morning. He accepted them with a seriousness that Caleb thought spoke well of the boy. On the 8th day of repairs, Brant came to the canyon. Caleb was at the gate mechanism when he arrived, with the blacksmith doing a second inspection of the repaired plate. Brant came down the slope and looked at the progress and said nothing for a while, just looked, the same taking in that Hale had done on his ridge visits, but without Hale's calculation underneath it. Talk to Hale, Brant said, and? He denied any knowledge of the men or their activity. Brant said it without expression. He also offered to produce an alibi for the night in question, which I didn't ask for, which tells you something about how the conversation went. Caleb waited. Don't have enough to charge him, Brant said. You know that. We both know that. 2 men whose names I don't have, who you saw but can't put in connection to Hale beyond one unfinished sentence. He paused. What I told him is that any further interference with this project, any of any kind, and I will be looking at him first and looking hard. And that if those 2 men surface anywhere in this county for any reason, I will be having a more detailed conversation with them about exactly who gave them directions to the Dawson Canyon at 2 in the morning. It wasn't justice exactly. Caleb had known it wouldn't be. Did he believe you? He asked. I think so, Brant said. Men like Hale respect specificity. They don't respect general threats because they're good at working around general things. But specific is harder to maneuver. Thank you, Caleb said. Brant looked at the limestone south wall, at the gate mechanism, at the repacked timber framework on the north side. He looked at it for a long time. My father worked a dry farm in Kansas for 20 years, he said, not particularly to Caleb. Spent half of that time watching men with more land than him control where the water went. He put his hat back on. Get this thing finished. He went back up the slope. The blacksmith watched him go and said, Good sheriff. Sometimes, Caleb said. Most sheriffs aren't good even sometimes, the blacksmith said, and went back to the gate plate. September moved toward October and the dam moved toward done. It was close enough now that Caleb could see it whole, could stand at the rim of the canyon in the early morning and see what it would be when it was finished, the way you sometimes see the final version of a thing when you're close enough that the remaining distance stops being relevant. The basin was clean and deep. The south wall was solid. Harlan had brought the limestone in 3 separate loads, and the facing was tight, the way only good stone laid carefully sits tight. The gate mechanism was repaired and improved, the secondary sluice fitted and functional. Evelyn's father's belt and suspenders arrangement translated into Texas limestone and iron, a generation and 2,000 miles from the Pennsylvania mill pond where the principle had first been used. What it didn't have was water. The sky had been empty since June. The creek on the east boundary of the ranch was a shadow of itself. Not quite dry, a thin, persistent trickle that the cattle could barely find. The well was holding, but only because Evelyn's rationing system had been so ruthlessly efficient that there were days when Caleb used less water than he'd have drunk on a normal summer morning years ago. The cattle were down to 23 head, and they were thin, and 2 of the cows had stopped producing, and the math was getting harder to do. He didn't say any of this to Evelyn. She was doing the same math herself and didn't need him to narrate it. What he did say, one evening in late September, was something else entirely. They were on the porch. Lily was inside asleep. The night was cooling fast, the way September nights in Texas cool, when the season is finally ready to shift, a drop of 10 degrees between sunset and full dark that felt almost generous after the summer. He'd been sitting with it for a while, the thing he wanted to say, turning it over the way you turn something fragile, checking for the places it might break. "When this is over," he said. She looked at him. "When the dam is done," he said, "and it rains or it doesn't—" He stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about what comes after." She waited. She was good at waiting, when she chose to be. "I don't want you to leave," he said. He said it plainly, because there was no other way to say it that was honest. "I'm not saying that because I need help on the ranch. I have Harlan and Decker, and I'd figure it out. I'm saying it because—" He stopped again. He was not good at this, had never been good at it, had always been better with physical things than with the vocabulary of interior ones. "Because the last 4 months have been the first time in 3 years that I've felt like a person instead of a man waiting for something to end." The night held around them. Evelyn looked at the dark yard, at the kitchen garden she'd put in along the south wall, at the stars coming up one by one over the hill line to the east. "Caleb," she said, "you don't have to—" "Let me finish," she said. Not sharp, just firm. She turned to look at him directly, the way she did when she was about to say something that required his full attention. "I came here with nothing, and you gave me room and work and a place for Lily. I know that. I know the weight of it." She paused. "What I don't want is for you to feel obligated to formalize something that's already working just because you think it's the right thing to do." "That's not what this is," he said. "How do you know?" "Because I've done the right thing for obligation before," he said. "It doesn't feel like this." She was quiet for a moment, a long moment, the kind that he might have filled with more words on a different night, but he knew her well enough now to know that pushing into her silences usually produced less than waiting through them. "I'm scared," she said finally. It came out matter of fact, not confessional, not dramatic, just true. "I came across half the country on the promise of a man who looked at my daughter and walked away. And I know you're not that. I know it. I've watched you for 4 months. I've seen what you are when it's difficult, and when it's fine, and when you're tired, and when you don't want anyone to see you tired. I know what you are." She paused. "But I'm still scared." "That seems like the right response," he said, "given the available evidence." She looked at him. "I'm scared too," he said. "I was scared the afternoon I picked up your bag at the station, and I've been scared most days since then. I don't know how to promise that goes away." "I don't need it to go away," she said. "I just need to know it's real." "It's real," he said. She held his gaze for a moment, checking, the way she checked everything, with that careful, dark-eyed attention that didn't let things pass until she was satisfied with them. Whatever she found, it was apparently enough. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. "Yes," she said. "All right." They sat in the dark a while longer, the night cooling around them, the ranch quiet in a way that felt different from the quiet it had held for 3 years. Fuller, somehow, or at least differently shaped. like a room that has been rearranged so that the same space holds more than it used to. Victor Hale made his last move on a Monday. Not a dramatic move, not men in the canyon in the dark, not lawyers at town meetings. The last move of a man who has run out of leverage is often a small one, aimed at the only pressure point still available. He went to the bank. Caleb found out because the bank manager, a slight nervous man named Pettifer, who had always treated Caleb with the careful politeness of someone managing a complicated relationship, came out to the ranch that Monday afternoon. He arrived in his good coat, which meant it was official, and he had a letter in his hand that he presented with the expression of a man delivering news he doesn't agree with and can't stop. The bank held the note on Dawson Ranch. It had been refinanced twice in the past 4 years, the way ranch notes on drought-stricken land tended to be refinanced, generously at first, then with increasing conditions. Victor Hale, it transpired, had purchased a partial interest in the note from the original holder 6 months ago, which meant he had a legal basis to call the remaining balance. Not all of it. A partial call, a third of the outstanding amount, due within 30 days. Caleb stood in the yard with the letter and read it twice. The amount was not astronomical. In a normal year, in a functioning ranch year, it would have been manageable, painful, requiring some selling, but manageable. In this year, with 23 thin cattle and no crop, and the dam not yet finished, it was not manageable. Not without selling the cattle he needed to keep the ranch viable after the dam, which defeated the purpose of the dam, which was probably the point. Pettifer was watching him with the expression of a man who knows what a letter contains and has opinions about it that his job prevents him from sharing. "How much latitude do I have?" Caleb asked. "The 30 days is in the terms," Pettifer said carefully. "I don't have authority to extend it unilaterally." He paused, with the specific quality of a pause that is not empty. "The board meets on the 1st of the month, which is in 9 days. A formal request, made in writing, citing the community endorsement of the reservoir project and its potential impact on land values in the valley, including the land securing the note, would need to be on my desk before that meeting." Caleb looked at him. 9 days, he said. "The 1st of the month," Pettifer repeated, and put his hat back on and returned to his buggy and drove back to town with the particular gait of a man who has done what he could. That evening, Evelyn wrote the letter. Caleb had the facts and she had the language for them. They'd figured this out weeks ago, without discussing it, the way they'd figured out most things. He sat across the table from her and answered questions while she wrote. And she asked good questions, the specific kind that produce useful answers. What the dam would do to assessed land value in the watershed, what the existing note structure looked like, what the board members' primary concerns were. He knew enough to answer all of it. The letter she produced was 3 pages. It was precise and well organized, and it made the argument not on sentiment but on financial grounds. The reservoir, once complete, would increase the productive value of every farm in the watershed that currently carried bank paper, which included, in one form or another, nearly a third of the notes the Creston Bank held. The dam's completion was the bank's interest, not its liability. He read it twice. "You wrote this before," he said. "I wrote something like it," she said, "in a different life for a different purpose. The argument is the same." She looked at the pages. "It won't be enough on its own. You'll need people at that board meeting." "I know." "Harlan," she said, "and Decker, if he's willing." "He'll be willing." She gathered the pages. "I'll copy it clean in the morning." "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. "Whatever happens with the bank," he said, "whatever happens with Hale, I want you to know that the last 4 months—" He stopped. He was, as always, bad at the interior vocabulary. "I want you to know what they've meant." She held the pages in her hands and looked at him across the table, in the kitchen of the house that had been emptied out for 3 years and was not empty anymore, and her expression was tired and clear and honest in the particular way it got when she had stopped holding something at arm's length. "I know," she said. "I think you know I know." He did. That was the thing about learning someone from the inside out. Eventually knowing becomes mutual, and you stop needing to say everything out loud. He nodded. She put the pages in order. Outside, somewhere in the dark beyond the canyon, the clouds that had been building for a week on the western horizon were moving east, slow and heavy, carrying what the land had been waiting for since June. Neither of them knew that yet. But the letter was written, and the dam was 6 days from finished, and on the first of the month the bank board would meet. And somewhere above Texas, a storm was finally deciding to arrive. The clouds Caleb hadn't seen yet were visible by morning. He stepped onto the porch at first light, and they were there. Not the thin, optimistic wisps that had been teasing the western horizon for weeks and then dissolving into nothing by afternoon, but real clouds, the kind that have weight to them, that sit low and gray and full in a way that the body recognizes before the mind does. He stood on the porch in the early cool and looked at them for a long time without moving, the way a man looks at something he's been waiting for so long that actually seeing it requires a moment of adjustment. He didn't let himself feel it yet. He'd been disappointed by skies before. Evelyn came out behind him with 2 cups of coffee and stopped when she saw his face, and then looked west herself. "How long?" she asked. "Hard to say," he said. "Could be today. Could be 2 days." She handed him the coffee. They stood together and looked at the clouds and didn't say anything else about it, because there was nothing useful to say, and they'd both learned by now that hope is a thing you carry quietly until it has somewhere to land. Lily appeared in the doorway behind them, her hair loose from sleep, holding her blanket by one corner. She looked at her mother, then at Caleb, then at the sky. She studied the clouds with the focused attention she brought to most things. "Rain," she said. "Maybe," Evelyn said. Lily considered this. "Yes," she said, with the confidence of someone who has made a final determination, and went back inside to find her shoes. The bank board met on the 1st of October, 9 days after Pettifer had delivered the letter from Hale's partial interest in the note. Caleb drove to town in the wagon with Evelyn beside him and the 3 pages of her letter in his coat pocket, clean copied, as she'd said, in her precise and unhurried hand. Harlan was already at the bank when they arrived, in his good coat, which he wore with the slight discomfort of a man whose good coat has spent most of its life hanging on a peg. Decker was beside him. So was Geary, whom Caleb hadn't asked to come, and who was there anyway, standing with his hat in his hands in the way that people stand when they've decided something matters and acted on the decision before being invited to. The board met in a back room that smelled of paper and old tobacco. 5 men, including Pettifer, who sat at the end of the table and said almost nothing for the first hour, which was different from saying nothing because his silences had direction. Hale's representative was there. Not the same lawyer from the town meeting, a different one, younger, with the over-prepared manner of someone who has been briefed extensively and is hoping the briefing covers the actual situation. He made the case for calling the partial note on schedule. He cited the terms correctly. He cited Caleb's payment history, which was imperfect in the way that drought year histories are imperfect, and he did it without cruelty, which almost made it worse. Then Caleb spoke. He didn't use notes. He'd thought about it and decided against it because notes would make him look like he was reciting rather than saying, and what he had to say needed to land as true rather than prepared. He laid out the dam, what it was, where it stood, when it would be finished. He laid out the watershed and the land values Evelyn had calculated, the farms that held bank paper and what they'd be worth in 3 years with reliable water versus without it. He said the number plainly. The reservoir, at full capacity, would increase productive land value in the watershed by an amount that made the partial note look like rounding error against the bank's larger exposure in the valley. Then Harlan spoke. Harlan spoke the way old men speak when they've decided that age has bought them the right to be direct. Not rudely, just without ornamentation. He told the board that he'd worked the canyon for 6 weeks without pay and would do it again, and that the reason he'd do it again was not sentiment, but arithmetic. He told them that 2 more dry years would see a third of the valley's working farms in default, and that a reservoir in the Dawson Canyon was the only thing he could see that changed that math. Decker said 3 sentences, all of them factual, all of them about specific numbers. Geary said 1, that he'd been on the fence about the whole project until he stood at the canyon rim on a Saturday in August and understood what was being built and who was building it, and that the fence was no longer where he was standing. The board deliberated for 40 minutes. They did not call the partial note. They issued instead a 60-day extension, formally tied to completion of the dam structure, and they did something that Pettifer had clearly worked on before the meeting. They reclassified the note against the reservoir's projected impact on collateral value, which had the practical effect of reducing Caleb's monthly payments for the following year by an amount that was not large but was real and specific and made the math workable. It was not a victory in the clean, unambiguous sense. Hale still held partial interest in the note. The legal relationship between them was not dissolved, just managed differently. A man with Hale's resources and Hale's temperament could find other angles if he chose to keep looking. But walking out of that bank building into the October morning, Caleb felt something shift in a way that was different from the shifts before. Not the precarious feeling of a battle going his direction for the moment, but something that felt more like ground under his feet. Solid. Earned. Harlan clapped him on the shoulder once, said nothing, and went to find his wagon. Evelyn stood beside him on the bank steps and looked at the western sky, which had moved considerably since morning. The clouds were closer, darker at their base. 2 days, she said, revising her estimate from the porch. Maybe 1, he said. She looked at him. Something passed between them that neither put into words. Not because they couldn't, but because after 4 months of learning to read each other, there were things that didn't need to be translated. We should finish the dam today, she said. He was already thinking it. Yes. They drove back to the ranch, changed into work clothes, and were at the canyon by noon. The crew was already there. All of them. Harlan, the Decker family, the Pruitt brothers, Geary and his son, Thomas and his younger brother, even Marsh the schoolteacher, who had become, over 6 weeks, genuinely useful with a shovel in a way that had surprised everyone, including himself. Pettifer, the bank manager, was there, which surprised Caleb enough that he stopped and looked twice. Pettifer was not in work clothes. He was standing at the canyon rim in his good coat, watching, and when Caleb looked at him, he gave a small, precise nod that communicated something specific without being able to say it out loud. The remaining work was the secondary gate mechanism, Evelyn's belt and suspenders secondary sluice, and the final packing on the north framework corners that the sabotage had displaced and the repairs had addressed but not fully finished. Caleb had known for days that with a full crew, it was a one-day job. He'd been running a reduced crew to conserve what little remained in the supply fund. Today, he had everyone. They worked through the afternoon with the clouds building steadily to the west, the sky darkening in the particular way it darkens before a serious Texas rain. Not dramatically, not all at once, but with a slow building certainty that changes the quality of the light and the feel of the air and makes the hair on your arms rise before you've consciously registered what's coming. Lily stayed close to the canyon rim with Thomas, who had appointed himself her unofficial supervisor for canyon-adjacent activities. She watched the clouds with the same focused attention she'd given them on the porch at dawn. Around 3 in the afternoon, she tugged Thomas's sleeve and pointed west and said, with her characteristic economy, "Soon." Thomas looked at the sky. "Yeah," he said, "pretty soon." The secondary gate went in at 4:30. Caleb drove the last bolt himself, with the blacksmith beside him checking the alignment, and Harlan at his other elbow making a sound that was not quite approval, but was the closest Harlan got to it, which was close enough. The framework corners were packed and secured by 5. The final check on the south wall facing, running hands along the limestone, checking the mortar seams, looking for any movement that shouldn't be there, took another 40 minutes. At 6:15, Caleb stood in the canyon floor and looked up at the structure. It was done. Not perfect. The south wall had a section near the middle where the facing wasn't as tight as he'd wanted. He'd run out of the best grade limestone and used what was available, and it would hold under normal conditions, but he'd want to address it before next summer. The north framework would need re-inspection after the first full winter cycle, because packed earth behaves differently once it freezes and thaws. The gate mechanism worked, but it was the first season for it, and first seasons always revealed something the plan hadn't accounted for. None of that changed what it was. He'd spent 2 years drawing this thing on scraps of paper. He'd spent 5 months building it with hands that had worked past blistered, past raw, past the point where you notice pain, because it's simply the condition of the work. He'd fought for it in a canyon, in a hall, in a bank room, against rumors and lawyers and men with pry bars in the dark. He'd done it, finally, not alone, and that last part, he understood now, was not incidental to what it was. It was the whole thing. He looked up at the rim. Evelyn was there, Lily on her hip, both of them backlit by the last light coming under the cloud bank from the west. She was looking down at him with an expression he didn't have a word for and didn't need one. It was the expression of someone watching a thing they believed in become real, and carrying the specific knowledge that believing in it, through all the days it wasn't real yet, was part of what made it so. He climbed up the slope. The first drop of rain hit his coat sleeve before he reached the top. It rained that night as if the sky had been saving it. Not a catastrophic rain, not the kind that floods and destroys, but the kind that means it, that comes in steadily and fully and does not stop after 20 minutes, the way false promise rains stop. It started just after dark, a soft percussion on the roof of the ranch house that woke Caleb at midnight and kept him lying awake, listening, counting the minutes. The way you count something you've waited too long for to be casual about. He got up at 2 and went to the porch. It was raining in earnest, a straight, serious fall, the kind that soaks into dry ground rather than running off because the ground is too hard to receive it. After months of drought that had turned the earth to something approaching stone, the first hour of rain mostly pooled and ran. But by the second hour, he could hear the difference. The sound of water finding purchase, soaking down, the ground beginning to give it somewhere to go. He stood on the porch and let it soak the shoulders of his coat and thought about the canyon, about the basin they'd cleared and deepened, about the gate mechanism sitting at its measured height, about the limestone facing on the south wall that was, right now, holding back the first real water it had ever been asked to hold. Evelyn came out behind him. She'd pulled her coat on over her nightdress, her hair loose, and she stood beside him and looked at the rain with the quiet intensity of someone watching something they've earned the right to watch. "It's holding," she said. She meant the dam. She couldn't see it from here, so nobody could, in the dark and the rain, but she said it with conviction, not as hope, but as conclusion. "It's holding," he agreed. They stood in the rain together for a while, getting wet in the way that you let yourself get wet when you've been waiting long enough that it stops mattering. Lily appeared in the doorway behind them, called by some instinct children have for the significant moments they're not supposed to be awake for. She looked at the rain. Then she stepped off the porch in her bare feet and stood in it, face tilted up, eyes closed, the rain hitting her face and her hair and her small, serious expression. "Lily," Evelyn said. "It's warm," Lily said, without opening her eyes. It was not particularly warm. It was an October rain in Texas, and it was cool and steady and real. But Caleb looked at her standing in it. This small person who had arrived at a railway station 5 months ago with nothing but her mother's determination and her own unshakable composure, and understood what she meant. Warm in the way that things feel warm when they are finally what they were supposed to be. Evelyn stepped off the porch and picked her up, and Lily put her wet arms around her mother's neck, and they stood together in the rain, and Caleb stood with them. And nobody said anything, because there wasn't anything to say that the rain wasn't already saying better. By morning, the basin had 3 feet of water in it. Not full, nowhere near full. It would take several good rains to reach capacity. But 3 feet where there had been nothing, 3 feet that represented every limestone block and packed earth corner and iron bolt and hour of work since June, translated into something you could see and touch, and that reflected the gray October sky back up at you from the canyon floor. Harlan came out to look at it that morning. He stood at the rim for a long time without speaking, his hat in his hands, the rain still coming down lightly around him. 3 feet, Caleb said beside him. 3 feet, Harlan confirmed, as if he needed to hear it said. They stood there a while in the particular companionship of men who have done hard work together and have reached the point where the result is real. Harlan had a quality in that moment that Caleb hadn't seen in him before, or had seen but not recognized. Something opened up in his face, some piece of the stubborn, contracted self-sufficiency that old men develop as insulation against disappointment. He looked younger and more tired at the same time, the way people look when they've been holding something tense for a long time and have finally let it go. Mary would have liked to see this, Harlan said. His wife. He'd mentioned her only once before, the night he'd said Evelyn's cooking was the best he'd had since she was alive. Caleb didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that kind of statement that wouldn't make it smaller. After a moment, Harlan put his hat back on. "I've got a fence to repair," he said, and walked back to his wagon, and that was the end of it, which was exactly the right amount of it. The letter from Hale came in the second week of October. Not from his lawyer, from Hale himself, in his own hand, which surprised Caleb enough that he read it twice before he believed what it said. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The first acknowledged the completion of the dam structure and its water rights standing, which had been formally clarified by the county recorder's office in the same week. Brandt had apparently moved on that question with a speed and decisiveness that suggested he'd been waiting for the right moment. The second paragraph released Hale's partial interest in the banknote, sold back to the original holder at terms Hale described as acceptable, which Caleb understood to mean terms that allowed Hale to exit the situation without public acknowledgement of why. The third paragraph was 4 sentences. It said that Hale had underestimated the scope of what had been built and the nature of the community behind it. It said that he was prepared to discuss, if Caleb was willing, a formal water access agreement for his own land on the North Ridge, the land he'd used as leverage, now requesting a cooperative arrangement instead. It said this was a business proposition, nothing more. It said he was aware that was a harder case to make than it had been 6 months ago. Caleb read those 4 sentences several times. He took the letter to Evelyn. She read it, put it down, looked at the window. He ran the numbers, she said. Finally. A man like Hale always eventually runs the numbers, she said. He just had to get to the place where the numbers didn't favor the fight anymore. Should I answer him? She considered it. Yes, she said, briefly. Tell him you're willing to discuss terms for water access, to be negotiated with fair representation from other valley farmers as parties to the arrangement. Not just him and you. Everyone the dam serves. She paused. If he wants the water, he joins the community that built the reservoir. He doesn't get a private arrangement. It was the right answer. He'd known she'd have it before he asked. He wrote the reply that afternoon, 4 sentences to match his. November came, and with it 2 more substantial rains that brought the basin to 1/3 of its capacity, which the engineers would later say. There were engineers eventually, from the county office who came out to certify the structure for the public water agreement, was sufficient to guarantee supply through a normal dry season. The cattle recovered slowly. Not all of them. He'd lost 4 more by the time the rains came, and those losses were permanent, the cost of the summer written in the herd size in a way that would take 2 seasons to fully address. But the remaining 19 head began to put on weight, and by December 3 of the cows that had stopped producing had started again, and the fields that had been cracked and pale since spring were showing the early green of soil that has remembered it can grow things. The kitchen garden was the first to come back. Evelyn's tomatoes and squash, which had survived the summer on wash water and sheer stubbornness, exploded in October with a late-season production that felt almost like argument, the plants making their case that they'd been worth keeping. She put up 11 jars of tomatoes and 8 of squash and set them on the kitchen shelf with the matter-of-fact satisfaction of someone who had been right about something all along. Lily helped. She was not technically useful at putting up jars. She was 2 years old and her contribution to the process was primarily aesthetic and motivational. But she was present, and she narrated proceedings in her particular way. And by the end of the afternoon, she had tomato on her chin and squash on her hands, and the expression of a person who has participated in something worthwhile. Caleb watched them from the kitchen doorway and thought about nothing in particular, which was itself a kind of luxury. The ability to stand still for a moment and not be calculating the next crisis, not running water math or cattle math or bank math, just watching the 2 of them in the warm kitchen light and feeling the specific weight of a life that is fuller than it was. They married in December. Not in the way that announcements are made about, not with ceremony or spectacle or a large gathering of people who came to witness. Caleb was not a man who was good at spectacle, and Evelyn had made it clear years before she arrived in Texas that she was not a woman who needed it. They went to town on a Tuesday morning, to the county courthouse where the justice of the peace had his office between the tax recorder and the land registry, and they stood in that small room with Harlan and Decker as witnesses and said the words that made it legal. Lily sat on Harlan's knee during the proceedings and examined the justice of the peace with her usual thorough attention. He was a large man with a red beard, and when it was over and he'd signed the register, he looked at her and said, "Well, young lady, what do you think?" Lily looked at him for a moment. "Good face," she said. The justice of the peace looked startled and then laughed, and Harlan made the sound that was his version of laughing, and Decker shook his head with something that was either amusement or resignation, and Evelyn turned to look at Caleb with an expression that was nothing he had a category for, warm and tired and present and entirely, specifically her. He thought, standing in that small room on a December morning in Creston County, Texas, about the afternoon in June when he'd picked up a travel bag at a railway station and made the small decision that altered everything after it. He thought about how it hadn't felt like a significant decision at the time. It had felt like the only thing a decent person could do, which is usually how the decisions that change everything feel: necessary rather than heroic, obvious rather than brave. He thought about Ruth. He let himself think about her fully, which he'd been letting himself do more often in the past months. Not with the constricted, careful grief he'd been managing for 3 years, but more freely, with more honesty about what had been lost and what that loss had cost him, and what it meant that he was standing in a courthouse in December feeling something other than the particular quality of existing without purpose. Ruth would have had opinions about all of it. She would have had opinions about Evelyn, measured and fair and expressed without softening. She would have had opinions about Lily that would have come out in the way she looked at her rather than anything she said. He didn't know what she would have concluded, but he knew she would have wanted him to be here, in this room, in this life, because she had known him well enough to know that a man who had nothing to build toward was a man slowly coming apart, and she'd have had no patience for him spending the rest of his life coming apart. He put her away gently, not away from him. He understood now that she wasn't somewhere separate, didn't need to be, just to the place where the grief had become part of the life rather than the shape of it. He took Evelyn's hand. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything about what was in the other's face because they knew it already, and the knowing had been built over months of work and argument and honesty and the specific intimacy of people who have been in difficulty together and come out the other side still choosing each other. The valley changed in the year that followed in ways that were both large and small, and the large ones were less important than you might expect. The water agreement that Caleb and Evelyn negotiated, with 7 other valley farmers as parties, as she'd insisted from the start, was signed in the spring and formalized through the county office with language that Hale's involvement had inadvertently improved, because his lawyer was thorough, and his thoroughness produced a document that covered things Caleb wouldn't have thought to cover. Hale paid into the maintenance fund like everyone else, neither more nor less. He attended the first joint meeting of the Reservoir Committee and sat at the end of the table and said little. He would always be a difficult man, and nobody expected him to be otherwise. But the specific difficulty of him had been redirected into a channel where it couldn't do the same kind of damage. Harlan's knee got worse in the winter and better by March, which was approximately what it always did, and he spent the winter mornings at the ranch kitchen table drinking coffee and telling Lily things she was too young to fully understand and that she listened to with complete seriousness anyway. He had become, without any formal arrangement or announcement, the kind of person who is simply present in a family's life, not in the sentimental way of stories, but in the practical, unglamorous way of someone who shows up on Tuesday and fixes the thing that's been broken for 6 weeks and stays for supper and goes home. Decker's boys, Thomas especially, became regulars at the ranch through the spring planting season, partly because the work was there, and partly because Lily had continued the daily rock sorting operation, and Thomas had found that he didn't mind it, which was the kind of thing that tells you something about a person. Dawson Ranch began to produce again. Not immediately, not dramatically. The fields that came back slowly, the way things come back when the underlying conditions have changed rather than just the surface circumstances. By the following summer, there was enough grass for the full herd, and the herd was back to 30 head, and Caleb had started quietly running numbers on the spring sale that suggested they might, if nothing catastrophic intervened, end the year with the note fully current for the first time in 4 years. He didn't tell Evelyn this. She was already running the same numbers. There is something that people who haven't worked land in difficult conditions tend not to understand about what that kind of work does to a person, and it is this: it does not make you harder. That's the version of the story that gets told. The frontier hardens people. Difficulty forges character like metal in fire. And those who survive it emerge stronger in the way that implies they've become something other than what they were. But that's not what happens. What happens is more complicated and less clean. Difficulty strips away what isn't load-bearing. It removes the parts of a person that were only there because conditions allowed for them. The patience with small things, the willingness to stay comfortable, the belief that most problems could be deferred. What's left is not harder, it's more essential. It's who you actually are when the extra has been taken away. Caleb Dawson had spent 3 years being the essential version of himself, and the essential version had been functional but incomplete, capable of surviving, not of living in the fuller sense, not in the way that involves other people and what they need from you and what you need from them. He'd needed the stripping away, and he'd needed what came after, which was the slow addition of something he hadn't had the room to grow back on his own. Evelyn Carter had arrived in Creston County with her essential self already exposed, because Harold Briggs and the years before him had done the stripping ahead of schedule. She knew exactly who she was by the time she stepped onto that platform, and she knew what Lily needed, and she knew that those two things were the only load-bearing walls she had left. Everything else she'd build when she had somewhere to build it. What neither of them had expected. What you can't expect because it's the kind of thing that only becomes visible from the other side, was that two people who've been stripped down to the essential tend to recognize each other without being able to name what they're recognizing. They'd been doing that from the first afternoon, in the particular way they'd moved around each other's limitations, filled each other's gaps, argued about the things worth arguing about, and let the rest go without needing to discuss it. That's not romance in the version of the word that comes with music. It's something with more weight to it. The specific thing that happens between people who have decided, without ceremony, that the other person's survival matters to them as much as their own. Everything else that grew between them grew out of that, which meant it had roots. On the morning of the first anniversary of the day, Caleb had picked up Evelyn's travel bag at Creston Junction Station. He found her in the kitchen garden before dawn. She was kneeling in the November dirt, doing something to the soil around the tomato roots. Not planting. It was too late in the season for that. But preparing, turning the ground over, and adding compost so that what she put in next spring would have something to push through. He stood at the garden's edge and watched her for a moment. She looked up. Unsurprised, she'd heard him come out. "You're up early," he said. "So are you," she said. He crouched at the edge of the garden. "What are you putting in next year?" She sat back on her heels and looked at the plot. "Same tomatoes. Better squash. I found seed from a variety that does better in dry spells. And corn, if the water holds the way I think it will." She paused. "And I was thinking we might expand the south end. There's room if we move the fence line." He looked at the south end. She was right. There was room. He hadn't moved the fence line because it had always been where it was, which was not actually a reason. "All right," he said. She looked at him. The garden and the house and the fields beyond it were coming up gray in the early light, the November morning holding its cold without apology, and Lily was asleep inside and the cattle were visible at the far edge of the north pasture, moving with the slow, purposeful energy of animals that have enough to eat, and the canyon was 2 miles east with its basin holding water enough for the season and the season after. "We're going to be all right," Evelyn said. Not a question. Not the willed assertion she'd made in the hard months when she was choosing to believe it because it was all that was available. Just a statement of fact, read from the available evidence. He looked at the garden and the house and the woman kneeling in November dirt planning next year's planting with the same matter-of-fact forward motion that had carried her through everything. "Yes," he said, "we are." She went back to turning the soil. He went to start the coffee. Lily would be up soon, with her blanket and her composure and her complicated opinions about rocks, and Harlan would arrive mid-morning and stay for supper without being asked, and the fence on the south end of the garden needed moving, and there was work. There was always work. That was the thing about land that people who don't live on it sometimes miss. The work doesn't stop when the crisis does. It just changes character, becomes less about survival and more about building. And building is harder to sustain in some ways because survival has urgency to pull you forward, and building requires you to pull yourself. It requires believing, on the ordinary Tuesday mornings when nothing is dramatic and nothing is at stake, that the thing you're making is worth making. Caleb Dawson had spent 3 years knowing how to survive. He had spent the last year learning again how to build. He made the coffee. Outside in the garden, Evelyn turned the soil over for next spring. The sun came up over the eastern hill line and hit the fields, and the garden, and the side of the house that had always caught the morning light, and the light fell on everything equally, the mended fence and the kitchen garden and the canyon beyond it, the way light does when it isn't trying to make a point. Just morning, just another day in a life that was, in all its imperfect and unglamorous truth, exactly enough.